Morning, everybody. There's a sort of a fallacy about funding in think tanks. People just sometimes say to me, "Oh, you should do something on this. You should do something on that." Genius. Where's the money? And so I'm particularly grateful at the outset, just to say that to John Patton and his team at Argentum Creek Partners for coming to us and saying, actually, we could offer some money to fund a bit of a focus on Kazakhstan. So thank you very much right at the outset. But as I know that people in this profession have suspicious minds, people who work on this region have suspicious minds, then I'll just say that this program today was designed entirely by Kate and myself to a lesser extent. And so it's Kate, actually, I want to thank more than anybody for the constant bombardment of questions and little annoyances over the last couple of months. So to Kate and to Argentum Creek Partners, my profuse thanks, as well as my apologies. So it seems to me that Kazakhstan was going to be the biggest story of the year at the beginning of this year. It was certainly was for the first few weeks of 2022. The unprecedented scale of the tumult there, the savagery, quite frankly, the implications, as ever, of the Russian involvement, whatever you think the nature of the Russian involvement was, and that's open for discussion, I hope, meant that it was front-page news for a while. And people who don't normally look at Kazakhstan, as none of us were looking at Kazakhstan. But never mind bloody January, then it was also the year the president of Kazakhstan finally asserted control, sidelined the Nazarbayev family, not an insignificant achievement after all this time, and a process that's still underway. So I suppose potentially there's a new Kazakhstan out there for the taking in some respects. Maybe the taking is the wrong word. Out there for the, out there anyway. Of course, we've had this, we've been here before, there have been opportunities before, they haven't been taken. So is it different? Is it different this time? Maybe these changes that have so long been promised, will they make it this time? And that's what we're here to discuss. So I'm delighted that we have the best possible panels of experts to do this. So in batting order, I'll just briefly go through them. Annette, I probably want to thank more than anybody else for not being here. Annette, I think, is contagious with some horrible malady. Annette, can you hear me? Yes, you can. So I'm very pleased that you're not here, but I'm also very thankful that you are here with us virtually and can give us the benefit of your. Honestly, Annette, you're the most precise and accurate analyst on Central Asia that I know, and you've been with us for so long now. Certainly for longer than I've been here in Chatham House. So I think about 22 years now. To my right is Bhavna Dave. Bhavna is a lecturer at SOAS at the University of London and is an expert on Central Asia and the politics of ethnicity in Central Asia and of transformation as well. Bhavna, I think, will follow Annette. I don't know, tell her the batting order, actually, doesn't matter. Are you going to go? It doesn't matter, okay. But anyway, Bhavna will speak about the transition and about the effects of the war, the context of the war in Ukraine. And last but not least, we have Aygerim Tulyakanova, independent journalist, researcher from Kazakhstan, currently in Prague, contributed to all sorts of fantastic articles that you've probably seen, and is also a UK government Chevening scholar. So thank you very much for joining us. Right, that is pretty much it, except for a little bit of housekeeping and format points. So it's a hybrid event, as you can see. There are plenty of people online. I'm not entirely sure how many. I'll work it out in a second. Presenters, 2 + 1, Annette, Bhavna, and Aygerim will have 10 minutes each. So we should therefore have a good hour. We'll eat into the coffee break, as I say. We're on the record. We'll decide whether to put this onto the web afterwards, if it's any good or not. Mobiles on silent, please. And it's split, I suppose, as you can see from the programs that you ought to have, is that the first session will look at the politics of the country and a little bit of the present and the recent past. And the second session, chaired by Kate, will look at the economics and have more of a look to the future. So that's roughly how it's divided up. That is that. So without further ado, thank you, Annette, for your superb overview that I know you're going to do. Over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, James. Can everyone hear me? Okay, wonderful. First of all, bear with me, please, with my half voice as I'm trying to get over the cold. But it's great to be here. Good morning to everyone. I'm going to give an overview of the situation in Kazakhstan as I see it. And I'll start by discussing the rationale underpinning the government's reform agenda before looking briefly at the process of de-oligarchization. I'll then look at some new directions in foreign policy and close with a few comments on the prospects for the development of a protest mood in the country. First of all, when talking about a reform agenda, President Tokayev is driven to proclaim the genesis of a new Kazakhstan in order to get across the message that the country is beginning a fresh chapter in its history following the events of January, and that he is the legitimate leader who is fully in charge. And his reform measures are meant to signal to the public that Nazarbayev is no longer in power, it's now Tokayev's Kazakhstan. In June, Tokayev carried out a referendum for the purpose of making 56 amendments to the constitution. Now, Kazakhstan's constitution has been repeatedly tinkered with ever since its adoption in 1995, and we can say with some conviction that this is a common and indeed a favorite pastime of authoritarian leaders. But by this stage, it's looking more like constitutional tampering than constitutional tinkering, given the continual changes and the ease with which they're made. So by way of comparison, in the United States, for example, a proposed amendment to the Constitution must be approved by 2/3 vote of both houses and then ratified by 3/4 of state legislators. Now, it's actually quite a difficult thing to achieve. The June referendum was heralded by the government as shifting Kazakhstan from a super presidential form of government to a presidential republic with a strong parliament. But the approved changes just don't bear out this assessment. So specifically, the president still maintains the right to appoint the prime minister and other key posts. The approved referendum provides for people in Kazakhstan to vote for mayors of oblasts, major cities in the capital, but there's a major catch. The candidates will be proposed by the president. So this is the way things are going. But it's the changes to the parliament that are particularly superficial. And in my view, for a fairly straightforward reason, as long as no opposition parties exist, genuine opposition parties, the president could in fact give all of his power to parliament, and it really wouldn't make much of a difference. The parliament is packed with Amanat members, and Amanat, the new Nursultan, is a presidential party whose purpose is to support the chief executive. Now, regarding the snap presidential election that is scheduled for later this month, presidential candidates must be nominated by an officially registered organization. So again, there is no space for a genuine opposition candidate. The timing of the snap election stems from an uncertainty surrounding Tokayev's retaining full control until 2024. Given social tensions, economic problems, and the presence of opponents within the elite. So if he were to have waited 2 years to hold elections, this would give society and the opposition time to mobilize and consolidate, and then the president could be presented with more serious competition. So following the January events, official authority was consolidated in the hands of Tokayev, and many members of Nazarbayev's inner circle either left their posts or were pushed out, and a very few arrested. But the expansive and complex system of intricate networks built up by the former president over the course of his 30-year reign remains in place. So major private businesses control huge swaths of the country's economy. And obviously it's difficult simply to excise corrupt elite to control such large and communicative and lucrative sectors, in banking, oil and gas. So Tokayev can't just burn his bridges with a significant part of the business elite, most of whom come from Nazarbayev's wider circle and are products of the system, as is Tokayev, of course. Consequently, there appears to be a deal brokered behind the scenes, and under this agreement, some elites transferred their loyalty from Nazarbayev to Tokayev, provided they were willing to share their wealth and invest in its projects, while key Nazarbayev loyalists were removed from their positions or left them. But in general, they weren't prosecuted or stripped of their assets, although there were some notable exceptions. We don't know if there'll be any other notable exceptions to that rule. And even though Nazarbayev himself has endured a dramatic stumble in status, he's still seemingly safe from prosecution or any such unpleasantness, and his immediate family are still fabulously wealthy. So there are two real problems with this unwritten transition agreement for the government, however. First, as Alexander Cooley has pointed out, Neither Tokayev, nor the Ministry of Finance, nor the central bank, nor the Prosecutor General's office knows the true extent of the global holdings of the Nazarbayev family. The former ruling family and its enablers spent decades stashing illegally acquired state funds overseas in preparation for just such a global asset hunt. So efforts to find and repatriate them would not only complicate Kazakhstan's political transition, but also draw in Western lawyers, accountants, and most likely reputation management firms. Second, Tokayev was not able to stop some Nazarbayev family members from fleeing abroad during the January unrest. A number of diehard Nazarbayev cronies have ended up in exile. And we now have some potentially powerful opponents abroad who have money and clientele within the state apparatus. This could eventually lead to conflict. So in a way, while Tokayev needs to keep his friends close, it's probably more important for him to keep his enemies even closer. Mm-hmm. In terms of foreign policy reforms, these are really moving away from the standard template, not least owing to the war in Ukraine and Tokayev's robust and fairly courageous stance against the recognition of the pop-up Luhansk and Donetsk republics in occupied Ukraine. Simply put, Kazakhstan is trying to break out of Russia's grip to a degree. At first, Kazakhstan was simply taking advantage of Moscow's weak position and its occupation with the war in Ukraine to pull away by balancing with other nations and reducing its dependence on Russian pipelines and ports. And in September, when the Chinese president made his first foreign trip since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic to Kazakhstan, where he met with Tokayev before the SCO summit in Samarkand, it provided the Kazakh president with a real opportunity to further this goal of moving away from Moscow, particularly as it had become clear that there were differences between Beijing and Moscow over a war in Ukraine. So shortly after the invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin began using economic levers against Astana by threatening Kazakh oil exports to Europe through the Black Sea port of Novorossiysk. This naturally fueled speculation that Russia was punishing Astana for not supporting its war in Ukraine. In addition, revanchist Russian critics have been directing bellicose statements towards Astana regarding the need to bring the country under better control and potentially even to denazify it. So enter Chinese President Xi Jinping into this context, who arrives in Astana pledging to resolutely support Kazakhstan in the defense of its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, warning in a clear nod to certain Russian threats against interference by any forces in the internal affairs of your country. Now, China is clearly fed up with the market disruptions caused by the war in Ukraine and is getting more so by the day. The conflict has roiled commodities markets and messed up supply chains, resulting in billions of dollars of losses for Chinese firms, just as the Chinese economy is slowing down. Not least, Chinese companies are important players in Kazakhstan's oil and gas industries, and all three existing lines of the Central Asia Chinese gas pipeline transit Kazakhstan. And so Beijing responded to Russia's blockading of Kazakhstani oil ports by canceling a major investment in Russia by Sinopec and warning state-owned energy firms to avoid any hasty purchases that could present secondary sanctions risk. Now, not long afterwards, the Turkish president flew to Astana and essentially echoed the Chinese president's words, declaring that Ankara will continue to support the stability, peace, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of brotherly Kazakhstan. Then the EU also decided to get in on the act when President Charles Michel very recently visited Astana and called for investment in Kazakhstan's transport infrastructure, and in particular, the middle corridor that bypasses Russia. Now, all of these issues, I could go much more in depth about all of them, just flying through them. This is really a topic for another day. So I'll sum up now because I've only got 10 minutes, and I'll make just a few concluding remarks. On the foreign policy front, in order to continue to attract foreign direct investment, it is crucial that Kazakhstan not be lumped together with Russia. This is a major factor explaining why Tokayev's government has gone out of its way to differentiate itself from its northern neighbor. On the domestic front, the president still sits on top of the pyramid of power, doling out posts and assets to allies in exchange for loyalty and a cut of the profits. State support is still directed towards supporting the oligarchy. To fundamentally dismantle the kleptocracy would be to risk toppling the system itself. Elites are prepared to support Tokayev, just as they were prepared to support Nazarbayev. If someone's entire professional career over a 30-year period has been shaped by an authoritarian system, then it's difficult to expect that they will want to reform it. Such a system is comfortable for Tokayev. He knows its in and outs, its specificities. So what we're witnessing now are colossal efforts undertaken at great expense to manipulate public opinion, although the reality consists of a number of superficial and technical reforms that allow the fundamentals of the system to remain the same. Now, if genuine opposition parties are allowed registration, then that would be a true hallmark of change. And this is a demand that we have been hearing solidly for more than 20 years. Many young people now view themselves as agents of change, and a culture of protest has been developing since 2011. So what I think we can say is that although we currently don't see mass protests on the street, the protest mood has not disappeared. There's still a lot of anger remaining over Bloody January, a belief that justice has not been done and no proper investigation has been undertaken. And if there's still no opportunity for regular people to be involved in politics, and the government persists in treating them as potential enemies of the state, and particularly if the perception remains that the country's immense oil-generated wealth is still not being distributed fairly, then it is reasonable to expect protest sentiment to continue to grow. So I'll leave it there. I'm really interested to hear the other panelists, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annette. That is absolutely perfect. You've really started us off well there. So much change and so much continuity. It's sort of depressing and also encouraging at the same time. Hard to explain. Actually, we'll go with Adrian next, I think, if that's okay. Talk a little bit about civil freedoms or lack thereof, the situation of the press, the media, the reforms, and the impact of geopolitics. So, thank you again. Over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor and pleasure to be here. I would like first to focus on January events and then move on to other issues. So I will be speaking more as a person from Kazakhstan because for me, January events were very, let's say, tragic and traumatic. And I also did not expect that something like this will happen in my country, because for all these years, peace and stability, like we've talked about it all over again and again. In general, I would say Kazakh population very much values peace, and they would go over and do their best to sustain good relationships with everyone. Now we have moved on from January events. It's been almost 10 months, and as Annette rightly pointed out, the justice has not been done. There are still a lot of families that are whose loved ones are being prosecuted, who suffered from tortures, who cannot get the justice done in Kazakhstan, because the whole system needs redesign, the whole system needs restart, and there are a lot of issues. And of course, January event was like a burst of all these accumulated over the decades issues. And recently, Tokayev said that January events are a shame, embarrassment to country's reputation, and I think that he meant mostly about the investment climate or other issues that are related to financing, but not to the people who live in Kazakhstan and those who have been continuously trying to fight for justice, to fight for better opportunities in the country. And we see again that it's kind of the same spiral of, let's say, continuous actions that people in Kazakhstan are being ignored. Their desires, their wills are not really taken into proper consideration. And even though we kind of discuss the political reforms here, how successful they've been after January events, I think that we also need to pay closer attention to socio-economic reforms, because they are actually the ones that kind of help political reforms to develop. And socio-economic reforms are not being done properly, as always, and there are a lot of people who are suffering economically, and there is high inflation, unemployment, and on top of that we have a very difficult geopolitical situation with thousands of Russian men coming, avoiding mobilization, rent prices going up, the job market is changing. So there are a lot of issues that Kazakhstan is facing, and I'm sure that Kazakh government is aware of it, and they are trying to react to the latest events as soon as possible. But to me, it seems that it's mostly reactive approach rather than proactive. Maybe it's justifiable given that there are just too many issues to deal with right now. It's really difficult geopolitical situation. It's difficult domestic situation, and Kazakhstan itself is a difficult country. It's not a monolithic country where there's just one ethnicity, one religion, or one language. It's a divided society. We have more than 100 nationalities. We have language issues. We have social problems, and we have identity crisis. We have Russian invasion into Ukraine, and all this anxiety in society that there might be some global war, there might be invasion in Kazakhstan. And we also have people who support the war in Ukraine. I mean, Russia's invasion into Ukraine in Kazakhstan. We have a very, let's say, strong influence of Russian propaganda in Kazakhstan. And it's also hard to deal with that because authorities are being very cautious not to anger Russia still. And it's the whole approach, again, was, I would say, Tokayev's approach is very cautious in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy. And to me, it seems that people in Kazakhstan, especially younger generation, they want some bolder actions from the government, because yes, Tokayev very bravely said in front of Putin that Kazakhstan does not recognize Donetsk and Lugansk, and that it supports territorial integrity of Ukraine. But at the same time, we see also that Putin is coming to Kazakhstan to different summits. People are being angry that this president of Russia is coming to Kazakhstan. They are protesting, they're being detained. And then we have in 12 days, presidential election in Kazakhstan. So there's going to be another drama with all this covering of the events, because as we see in general, when some election approaches, there is increased pressure on civil society, on activists, on the press. Just recently, Tokayev mentioned that they will protect the sacred sovereignty and of Kazakhstan, and we need to protect the country from many cyber attacks or informational attacks, which also kind of hints on potential pressure on independent media. And given that in Kyrgyzstan we also see recent detentions and closure of some independent media, it's a very worrying sign to me, because right now I think that we don't know what is going to happen even in a month or in a year. And I think that no one knows, and everyone is trying to navigate as like every day just to see what is coming from day to day. But I would say that this whole reforms and the rhetoric from the government that there is a democratization, but it's slow and at its own pace. We don't do anything revolutionary. To me, it seems that this kind of speed of democratization is barely visible to people because, as Annette again pointed out, this whole system is the reform package is designed to keep the major powers still in power, and we see that there has been very little room for genuine opposition, for independent media outlets to really prosper and develop and not being afraid of persecution. And even like connected to recent January events, there was one journalist recently who was accused of capturing the airport during January events, which is a kind of a weird statement. Yeah, I mean, we see a lot of problems in Kazakhstan, and it's very worrying to me personally as a citizen of Kazakhstan. And I think that right now people are aware of all these problems and they want to contribute, but they're not given the chance to contribute properly in the political system. And I think it should change if Kazakhstan doesn't want another repetition of January events, and that there should be much bigger focus on social reforms in Kazakhstan. Because just another recent event, we have seen a tragic death of 5 people in the coal mine of ArcelorMittal. And even though such cases happened before, people didn't, like, maybe they paid attention, but it wasn't covered as widely. And now we see that this tiny social issue gets a lot of media exposure. And people who don't even live in Kazakhstan, sometimes they work and live abroad, they still care and they write about these issues and they want to contribute. And we need to solve more domestic issues now, because if domestic issues will not be solved, it's going to be a destabilization, I think. And given that Tokayev is a top-class diplomat, he feels very confident in the foreign policy, but the domestic issues are still there. And I think there should be extra effort to pay attention to that. So that's it from me.
Superb. Thank you ever so much, Jeremy. I'm ever so grateful, and you've really added some layers on a personal and professional note on top of what Annette's already given us. We'll come back to you. So many questions. Lovely. Over to you then. So, as I say, the war and the reforms, effectively, I think, is what you're covering. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I start, thank you, Aygerin. It was very good to hear your perspective as a person from Kazakhstan who has been witnessing these things from the outside and very much connected to people there. And Annette, of course, for laying out the whole context, for talking about the difficulties of the de-oligarchization that is seemingly being promoted by the Tokayev government. So what I will do is offer comments on this whole idea of new Kazakhstan reforms, what Tokayev is trying to do, and then move on to talk about the effects of the current situation, the war in Ukraine, how the Kazakhstani government and people are responding to what's happening, and what also they expect, what the people expect their government to do. I was in Kazakhstan in July, August for about 4.5 weeks this summer. And this was after 3.5 years that I visited Kazakhstan. I used to visit it every year, but because of COVID and everything else, I couldn't go, and most of us are in the same position. going there after such a long time really made it clear to me how much the country has changed over the last 3 years, just not visually in terms of how the cities look and how people dress and how they conduct themselves, but also so much else that's going on. And especially this year, we have seen that when I was started talking to people in Almaty, Astana, the three things that everyone talked about. First was the events in January, and especially for people in Almaty, this was a very traumatic, very unexpected thing. The second topic that everyone talked about was that there is need for reform, and we are fed up of all these slogans and what the government is promising and other things. Just get down to business, get things done. And they don't have faith. And I was talking to people in Almaty, Astana, who most of these are professionals, younger people, some connected with government. Most of them are independent, engaged in a variety of ways in these debates. And the general chorus of opinion was, well, maybe something is being done, but all these reforms which are being implemented, they have been long overdue, 20 years. People, opposition and others have been asking about local elections, asking about reducing the powers of the president, having independent institutions. So nothing new. It's just long delayed things which are now in piecemeal fashion or sometimes as a package deal being delivered. And the third thing, of course, was people's anger about what's happening in Ukraine, and also this fear that will Kazakhstan be next, and how Kazakhstan is being squeezed by Russia, and how unable or ineffective their leaders are in terms of speaking up, even though they are speaking up. Also important, I would say, when we talk about the reforms, very important to keep in mind this fact. The slogans of the protesters in January, when they were saying in Kazakh, "Shal ket," old man, leave. Now, in a country such as Kazakhstan, where there is this tradition of respect for elders, even if the elders are not right, you treat them with respect and some consideration. In that context, for people, younger people, to come out, and these are not just urban people who seem to be more westernized or globalized, these are people of rural, other backgrounds. For them to come out and say these things is quite revolutionary, and this suggests that there's a very, very important generational shift that's going on. So the whole verkhushka, the top apparatus that is still being dominated by older people, and even though many in that government apparatus are younger people, they may be young in terms of age, but they're not necessarily young or new in terms of their independence mindset. So there's a mix of them. But fundamentally, there is this generational shift. So I can talk more about that later. Talking about the Tokayev government also, the process of de-Nazarbayevification that he has launched in economic sphere, that will be discussed in the second session. But in terms of the political elite, the composition of the political elites and the appointments of key persons, we find that this process looks very unclear at the moment. So, of course, most of Nazarbayev loyalists in top positions have been replaced. The mayors, the akims of the Almaty, Astana, both cities were replaced. And it just seems that Almaty Akim seems to be modeling himself on Sobyanin in Moscow, just taking care of city, making it safe and beautiful and everything. And these are the things that people appreciate. But Tokayev's team on the whole, from what I heard from people in Almaty, Astana, basically was that it doesn't really have any competent people. So this mix of some technocrats, professionals, well-educated people, but they don't really have power, they don't have understanding, and there are many others who may be promoted because of various connections. So there are no names that really give hope to people that these are competent people. So on the whole, there is a sense of lack of clarity about what this whole team is going to deliver and how independent, capable they are. Tokayev also talked about this concept of a listening state, the state that's going to listen to people. So there is listening going on, but because people haven't been allowed to speak, articulate their opinion in the way they wanted, there's also a lot of talking going on. There are different groups, younger people, different kind of regions, other groups, they have their own opinions to articulate. So there's a whole cacophony of opinions in public sphere that one hears. And it seems to me, it's not clear who the regime is listening to first and to what extent they are able to actually listen to genuine grievances which are coming from below. So there's selective listening going on, it seems to me. The various reforms and amendments which have been passed, Annette has very well articulated those things. I talked to one key officer in the regime, probably among the top 3-4 persons, who talked to me, who said, see what we have done. We have adopted so many laws. We have passed all these amendments. We are doing all these things. It takes time, but we are doing everything. And then the question is, it's not just a question of adopting these laws and making amendments and liberalizing and other things. These kinds of changes in law cannot take effect if there are no proper institutions. And the institutions that need to function independently are the parliament. The parliament requires political parties, also conducting free and fair, genuinely open elections requires proper time and environment for the political parties to register and campaign effectively. It also requires a much more freer media space, not just that everyone is taking refuge in social media, but also on the state television and so forth. It also requires an independent constitutional court, independent judiciary, a system of accountability, and transparency about how things are done. So these package of reforms, how much input there has been from people from the lower strata, from the societal strata, that is something that remains to be seen. Other thing, the whole talk about reform, and I was just reflecting on the term. What does reform mean? Reform. So the form is going to be renewed, but the form, it's about the form, and it's not really about the substance of the institutions, about the functioning of institutions. So there is this just a fixed kind of mindset there's not much reflection going on among the people seemingly promoting these reforms about the need for institutional change. And you cannot create institutions overnight. The biggest legacy of the Nazarbayev system has been the lack of institutional fabric in the society. So the institutions that existed were simply installed, put top down with the Nursultan party or all kinds of foundations and everything. The parliament packed with the regime people and families and clients and others. So there hasn't really been so those institutions are not functioning, and whatever institutions that existed that were created by Nazarbayev under Nazarbayev system had a very personalized functioning. So they were not really they were not grounded in society. Do you have
a couple of minutes? Absolutely.
So I don't really get to the Ukraine war and other situations, so maybe I'll address that during questions. Okay. Because I just realized as I was speaking, that the domestic situation is quite tense, and people, especially the younger people, are really asking, and they're impatient for change, and they want everything first. So now talking about Ukraine, certainly Kazakhstan has been positioning itself very carefully, and Tokayev has given the kind of signals, he has made the kind of statements that the international community needs to hear. He has also been very cautious about making statements to Russia. Yes, of course, the Kazakhstan did issue the clear statement that they will not recognize the DNR and LNR, Lugansk and Donetsk republics. At the same time, Kazakhstan has in the UN the resolution, the various resolutions calling for Putin, Russia to be tried of war crimes and other things. Kazakhstan has continued to abstain. In current context in Kazakhstan, people can simply, without any restraint, openly express their support and solidarity to Ukraine. But if you want to go in public sphere and say something like down with Russia, Putin, or some other thing, then the government gets very touchy about it. So many Russians coming to Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan has formally said that they will not simply extradite all these people because there's no legal basis to it. At the same time, they say that they will hand back people with criminal and other kind of background. So just a couple of days ago, the Russian journalist from Buryatia, who was detained in Kazakhstan because she has been labeled enemy of state, because she talked about the mess that the war is and how the mobilization campaign is not working. So Kazakhstan detained, it's not clear what's going to be done. So there are going to be a lot of these cases where the government says one thing at top, it says the right kind of things, but what actually happens on the ground is something very different. And this is where a lot of younger people mention that they just find that the people at top and the various levels of government, administration, are so afraid, and they're so much also closely connected with this idea of maintaining stability, maintaining control, and also keeping good relations with Russia and very carefully managing it, that they are not really in a position to actually speak up and take an independent stance. There's also a lot about Tokayev's statement, seemingly brave statement in St. Petersburg earlier. There are many people who say that the statement was actually first shown to Putin and it was agreed upon. So Putin was not surprised. Now we have no way of knowing these things, but the fact that in the society, people are not impressed so easily by these performative kind of enactments. And there is this malaise that we are seeing everywhere, that this distrust of whatever facts or whatever information that comes out, and people draw their own conclusions. So finally, to conclude, I would say that the process of the de-oligarchization, de-Nazarbayevification, everything has just about started, and we shouldn't be expecting any concrete results. Tokayev seems to be making statements, restraining himself, restraining the rule, restraining the power of his presidency. But all it will take is some kind of crisis, some unforeseen event, maybe connected with Ukraine and Russia's behavior, or some internal conflict that can very quickly change, and under the guise of dealing with the emergency and the unexpected situation, the presidency can start to once again acquire more powers and not hand over, not prepare future generation. Thank you.
Pavna, thank you very much indeed. A brilliant presentation, as were Aigerim's and Annette's as well. And it's a confusing picture, it seems to me, because you've all been in, it seems to me, actually complete agreement. I have not noticed any disparity between any of your presentations. Because on the one hand, we're seeing here never before seen occurrences, but at the same time, the essential dynamic of the system remains the same, even with different people. So it is a confusing picture, and whether the intent as well as the capability to change is still very unclear, it seems to me, and that's come across in all your presentations. What hasn't come across, we've only really touched a little bit on the war, as you say, Bhavna, so I hope we can get into that. It does seem to me that war means that Russia is depleted, it is weakened, and therefore if Kazakhstan does wish to break away, from the Soviet yoke and from a Russian grip, then there will never be a better time than now. But whether it wants to or not is, again, an open question. You said looking very tough. Well, you said they're touchy, and you said they're hesitant about taking on Russia or criticizing Russia in any way. So we have exactly 45 minutes, because I'll eat 15 minutes into the coffee break. So we've got 45 minutes for questions and discussion. Those of you online, about 35 of you by the looks of it, please send your questions into the Q&A. As John Hevershaw already has, I'll come to yours first, John. I'll have to read out your questions, so go easy on me, please. But also to take questions from the 35 or so people in this room as well. So keep your hands up whilst I make some notes there, and I'll do John's in a second. I'll do John's first of all. So that's the plan, okay? I'll do John's question first, which is actually to Annette, and it'll give everyone else time to. I see people have already formed their questions. That's great, but I'll do it that way. So thank you, John. John Hevershaw, University of Exeter. Annette, here we are. Could the strategic use of Magnitsky-style sanctions against selected Nazarbayev-era elites have enabled Tokayev to go further in his campaign against them and to have encouraged reforms? Why was the UK so unwilling to sanction our friends, quote unquote? Was it the distraction of Ukraine, possibly, I suppose, a reasonable excuse, if you like, or was it, in fact, the UK-Kazakh ties, especially in legal services and reputation laundering? And then there's a part B to John's question. It's a slightly cheeky one. It's the sort of question I would expect in Chatham House, where we should have open, free and frank discussion about everything. So I think it's an entirely excellent and valid question. So part B, Annette, or Bhavna, if you wish to take it on, or Adrian, it's entirely, we can go around. But John says, Nazarbayev remains the honorary patron of the British Kazakh Society, whilst the UK ambassador to Russia, Kathy Leach, is the honorary president.
Kazakhstan.
Yes. What did I just say? Sorry. Do such formal and informal relations advance the national interests of the UK and of Kazakhstan, or do they advance the private interests of very wealthy elites in Kazakhstan and their enablers and allies in the UK? So there's two connected questions there. Hope that's clear. Annette, can I start with you, please?
Okay, I might have to ask you to repeat the first part of John's question again, actually, but
the first one or the second? Sorry.
The first one.
Yeah, okay. So I'll take it again. I'll get more slowly. Could the strategic use of Magnitsky-style sanctions against selected Nazarbayev-era elites have enabled Tokayev to go further in his campaign against them and would encourage reforms? Was the UK, or why was the UK so unwilling to sanction its friends? Was it the distraction of Ukraine, or was it in fact UK-Kazakh ties, especially in legal services and reputation laundering?
Right. Well, I think probably John himself could answer this question better than me, to tell you the truth. I mean,
we don't have a facility for John to come in here, I'm afraid. So it's all.
Yeah, he's the real expert on this, as we all know. But I mean, it's this problem of, I mean, we know why the Dinar, Jariga actually managed to win her case. And this is because, of course, they went back to Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan said, oh, no, she earned her money very legally. Now, if Kazakhstan were to attempt this again, they would obviously encounter tremendous problems. And this is something, of course, that Alexander Cooley has written about, that it would not only complicate the political transition, but can you imagine the number of Western lawyers, accountants, as I said, reputation management firms that would be brought into this process? I think it would just derail Kazakhstan at this point. So I really am not sure at all that Tokayev will choose to go in that direction. I'm not sure, actually, if I answered his question.
So the second part of the question is, why did we not sanction? Why did the UK not sanction?
Why did the UK not sanction
anyone in Kazakhstan?
From what point in time is he referring to?
Let's see, from January. Let's take it from January.
Well, I mean, we see, again, I refer back to what happened with Jariga. We know very clearly why this did not work out and why this has not worked out. And I think if we see here now the EU, again, getting, sort of jumping on the bandwagon now of having Tokayev's back, just as China's done, just as Turkey's done, because of course everyone wants to promote this middle corridor, this route that bypasses Kazakhstan, that bypasses Russia. And this is certainly a very advantageous thing to do. This is something we all want. But nonetheless, in doing so, we will be supporting regimes like Kazakhstan. We could even be potentially supporting regimes like Turkmenistan. Is this really better? This is really a question that we have to ask ourselves. But I think that I would like to defer to either Igarim or Bob.
Okay. And I'll come to him. And I'll come to him in a minute. But I'm going to, whilst I've got you, I'm just going to do the second part of John's question again. The point about the items, if you like, the formal and informal relations, such as the UK ambassador to Kazakhstan being the president of being the honorary president of the British Kazakh Society. I mean, and John asks, do these formal and informal relations advance the national interests of the UK or the private interests of wealthy elites? What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just the usual conundrum. I have to say, John, that this is nothing in my mind that is unique to Kazakhstan. We see exactly the same thing with Uzbekistan, even astonishingly with Turkmenistan. It's simply this idea that it's better somehow to engage, sort of to maintain this pretense that, this isn't really a kleptocracy, this isn't really a corrupt regime, and we maintain our presence because having our presence there is better than not having our presence there. And we see exactly the same thing happening now. And there are serious economic reasons, as I say, the middle corridor and the advantages of that, although it's a long way to go and needs so much investment. So I think it's just that general conundrum that we've had for years. I don't really think there's anything different here happening.
Fair enough. Do you have a take on this, Adrian? Do you mind if I offer it to you? If you like, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I don't know what to say.
Okay, fine. No problem. I won't push you on that. It's not fair. Not fair. Bhavna?
One sentence that I endorse what Annette said, and if you see this government, the emphasis on having developing business connections, foreign investors, and everything, if that has been the Tory policy, kind of. The same thing has happened with respect to Modi when the Indian delegation comes and the wooing of the business and not really making statements about other troubling political things. So yeah.
Understood. I do think, for what it's worth, that there has been a confusion over the years in British diplomacy at the top level between people, their political responsibilities and trade and economics, and those two things have become merged in several positions, I've noticed, not just in Kazakhstan. Oh yes, go for it, Adrian. Yeah, please.
Just a thought that all these kind of, formal relationships, agreements, they actually may be covered in local media in Kazakhstan and kind of legitimize the current regime. And people might think that, yeah, Kazakhstan is doing great internationally, is friends with everyone. And given that we didn't really have a lot of choice in the beginning to have a better options, people will it will somehow informally lead people to support more the current regime. And I think, the governments like UK and other countries actually need to rethink how they do these formal things, because in Kazakhstan and other countries, it can be covered in a way that is viewed positively, and that the current administration, the government, is doing great internationally. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed. Right. Thank you for starting off with a spicy one, John. I've got Alex, Paul, Yannick, John Luff, that is, and Anna Matveeva, and a couple on the screen as well. If I've missed you, then let me know again. Yes, and you, sir. Thank you very much indeed. In fact, I'll go to you first because I think I saw you first. So please.
Thank you. I'm Hugh Williamson. I work for Human Rights Watch. Nice to be here. Thanks so much for organising this event, James. Nice to see you again. And go back to the January events, and thanks so much for Igarim's comments on that. As we all know, probably by far the worst human rights event in Kazakhstan's modern history. As you said, Igarim, there's been no no serious or credible investigation into what's happened. The main activities have been prosecuting protesters rather than those responsible for the 230 people who were killed during the protests and the hundreds injured. I think it's clear that the government is unwilling to properly investigate what's happened, and find those responsible for the killings on the streets of Almaty and elsewhere. My question is, I'm keen to dig into the conversation we've just been having a little bit about the role of Kazakhstan's partners. It seems to me that this is both an urgent opportunity, an urgent necessity on the part of Kazakhstan's partners, given the severity of what happened. So the EU, the UK, the US, to really press the case with Kazakhstan to bring accountability for what happened, for get them to change their path. We've just been discussing how basically Kazakhstan is unwilling to change its path of behavior on these things. So their own instinct is not to investigate the role of security forces in killing people in Almaty, but there's a clear role and urgency for other countries to do so. I'm keen on the panel's perspective on that. And obviously there's some leverage at the moment as well. Kazakhstan is keener than ever on its multi-vector foreign policy, on reinforcing ties with countries other than the West. So keen to hear your views on how Kazakhstan's partners, particularly in the West, could use their leverage to change the path of Kazakhstan on accountability issue.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Hugh. Yeah, nice to see you again too. We'll do it in reverse order, perhaps. Bhavna, can I come to you first? So, is there an urgency to pressure Kazakhstan, and how will it affect the multi-vectorization, etc., etc.?
There's a lot of pressure on the government to, especially from people in Almaty who saw these events and just are completely frustrated and angry also that there has been no proper inquiry. Mind you, this is not the only event, this is the major traumatic event that happened in independent Kazakhstan, but even if we go back to the 1986 riots in Almaty, that were when Tokayev was replaced with Kolbin, who was brought in from Georgia or whatever, and then Nazarbayev was waiting to take charge because he still didn't have the kind of support, and without Gorbachev's support, Moscow's support, he wouldn't have become the president. And under Nazarbayev times, though, all these events, there was just a different spin put on it, and all the people who made sacrifices, Jeltoksan was celebrated, monuments were constructed, but there was no proper inquiry. And I was doing research at that time as a PhD student, and I wanted to, some archives, national archives, presidential archives were open for a short time. I wanted to go, and I was told, well, wait for some time, they're reorganizing everything, and then everything closed down. So I don't think anyone had access, even though they had formally said that archives are open. So that has set the tone. So that if it's not just these January events, there's so many other previous things that need to be investigated. The second about the about the events, I was talking to one person who was a civil rights activist who was on the square and protesting. I mean, these are things we have read about, but I just heard it from this person where he said they were trying to help people who were wounded. And I mean, they also saw that suddenly some kind of rioters out of nowhere came and hijacked the peaceful protest. So these were the people who were brought in. But anyway, there were a lot of people killed. And so they were trying to help these, not killed. In this case, they were trying to help the person who was injured. And they saw ambulances coming in. And they tried to go to the ambulance, except that this was not an ambulance. It was, these were security services vehicles kind of appearing as ambulances. And of course they were, so anyway, a lot of these things were reported, and this person had tears in his eyes when he said, I've not seen anything like this. So that kind of anger and shock for younger people in Kazakhstan, many of them, I'm talking about Almaty, many of them who have studied abroad, who are quite globalized in their outlook, who aspire to live in societies that they see outside, and who this kind of rhetoric and this kind of gloss over the situation is completely shocking to them. So So I think it's a huge issue which is not going to go away.
Can I turn to you, Ajarim, if you've got any comments on the advisability of Western pressure on Kazakhstan, but also I'll just add something to it as well to complicate your life, from Arman Kojakeldiev. And he says, excuse me, something just come up on my screen, get that down. It says, could you also comment on Tokayev pardoning the police officers that participated in the January event? Is this an attempt to ensure loyalty of law enforcement in the light of the coming elections? So both.
Okay, first with Western pressure. Of course, I mean, usually it works this way, like you pressure the government to investigate certain things, but after the war in Ukraine, I don't know if international system is working anymore, because we witnessed that another country can openly bomb another independent state, and the world is still pressuring, putting sanctions, but there is no like physical help, something that would be more helpful to survive this. And I'm sure like if Western governments would pressure Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan would answer, yeah, we will do our best and we're doing our best. But it's essentially kind of in the government's hand to kind of say that the investigation is over, or that we did what we could and now we're moving on. Mm-hmm. And like with the recent amnesty as well, that is connected to the second question, that we just need to close this tragic page. And given the Soviet past, it's a very repetitive pattern. We don't really like to dig deep into the history and open up this traumatic past. So yeah, I mean, it might work, but essentially, if there is no genuine government desire to do that, which I don't see now, nothing will change in these terms. And the second question about the pardoning the police officers and the participated, yeah, it's connected to the amnesty, recent amnesty that Tokayev signed. A lot of civil rights activists and human rights activists criticized this amnesty law, and I think, yeah, it's a kind of the good connection that we are having elections, presidential elections in less than 2 weeks. And of course, there will be a lot of resources used, administrative resources, legislative resources, some other resources to bring as many people to support the current government, the current president. And it's all a very complicated political game, and it's just one tiny part of it. So it can very much be connected.
Super. Annette, I know you've got something to say on this.
I'll just say something very quickly, James. So first of all, the demand for an international investigation surrounding the events of January has been on the table for months. We've been hearing this demand put forth to the government. They've resolutely refused. So my point here is that this is really a red line for them. There's nothing that we're going to do to convince Tokayev's government to undertake an international independent investigation of what happened. This is a no from them. So what has happened instead, of course, is the issuing of this amnesty law, which Agarim just pointed out. Rights activists have said that this mass amnesty was initiated to help law enforcement officers who opened fire at unarmed demonstrators evade accountability. And so that's regarding that. In terms of the West and any impact it could have on the situation, I think that we are constantly hearing now about Kazakhstan multi-vectoring again, which of course indeed it is, but let's not forget that the direction is also, or rather that there's also a reverse direction here. That is, Western states and non-Western states are getting in line now to support Kazakhstan. And a lot of this, of course, has to do with, as I mentioned before, the advancement of alternative trade routes. And unfortunately, I think that these concerns are going to continue to trump any human rights concerns, particularly when Western powers are faced with odious regimes like, Vladimir Putin's at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, I'll come back to the floor. Anna, please.
Yes, thank you. So Kate wanted me not to ask difficult questions. So I'm going to ask an easy question.
Difficult so far.
Yeah, maybe to Bhavna and Aigerim, but yeah, also maybe to Annette. Kind of coming back to the January events, may I ask you to reflect a little bit more about their causes and what do you think actually led to them, fundamentally, and whether you see it as a watershed moment in Kazakhstan's political trajectory, whether we should start looking at it in a different way, that yes, that's now social forces became actors in their own right, that leaderless uprising is possible. So now we should we still continue looking at Kazakhstan through a prism of elite bargaining, coalition, oligarchic capitalism, or should we look at other categories like minority relations with minorities, center-periphery tensions, countryside being neglected, aggrieved, generation change? Should we kind of look into different categories rather than we normally analyze Kazakhstani politics through constitutions, lead bargaining, who is taking which post, and maybe putting it in the context of Central Asian politics? Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan embarked on reforms. Kyrgyzstan also some degree of parallels.
I have it. Thank you, Anna.
Yeah,
and I'm going to make you. And these are complex questions and they're important questions. And I'm actually going to make your question about the causes of January even more controversial, and ask the panel if they could also particularly comment on where they stand on whether Russia was an instigator of what happened in January. So we can get spicier indeed. Annette, let's start with you this time again.
I don't think actually that Russia was an instigator of what happened in January.
Okay.
And the more that we think about it, actually, I don't think we should actually be even that surprised that what happened in January happened. There was no way we could predict that it was going to play out that way, and it was a tremendous shock. But the tensions inherent within the dual power arrangement ultimately gave way to insurrection on the part of those Nazarbayev loyalists who feared a loss of power and wealth, particularly considering the former president's advanced age and declining health. And I'm just going to leave it with that soundbite, and I'll hand it over to the other two panelists.
Yes, fair enough. Thank you. No, good enough. Bhavna.
Thank you. January events, if we have more time, there's a lot to be said, so if I have to give a 2-minute answer, I don't think we can even look at these in terms of cause of these things. Of course, there's a context that there was this discontent. The Tokayev regime hadn't really addressed a lot of these issues. What happened in January was unprecedented. So on the one hand, we have the peaceful protests in which civil society, other students came out. But then suddenly the hijacking in Almaty, the hijacking of the protests by the crowds who were clearly, they were supporters or they were patronized by the Satyabalde and then other people in the security services. So in a country which has been so top-down control, where you don't have right to public assembly, it's not that easy. The right to have public assembly without permission. It's not easy suddenly for hundreds of people to come out and seize the airport. When we were following the events, and I was following it suddenly, I wasn't even particularly following. Somebody told me that, do you know what's happening in Almaty? And we were all shocked by this. And those of us who have been to Almaty, we just know that it's not so easy just to go and take control. So without the support, involvement of very important people in the security services, and just final thing that what Tokayev is very afraid of, he knows that the security apparatus, security services and the police at various levels is very, very fractionalized. There is no unified command. There are also what they say is penetration of all kinds of Islamic ideas, ideologies, which is also probably governmental kind of lens to describe this. But the fact that it's very faction-ridden is true.
And while I've got you, just the second part of Anna's question on how should we look at Kazakhstan right now, a watershed moment? How should we?
I think it depends on what issue we are looking at.
Well, that was the question.
Sorry.
Yes, well,
No. I haven't got time to keep on going through the questions again. But
I think it is nothing like how should we. I think we should pay attention also to the specifics.
Sure.
Rather than just kind of have a general lens, pre kind of selected lens to look at it.
Correct. That's a good answer. Thank you very much indeed. Ajum, you actually said in your presentation, I think, that the January events were an accumulation of long-held grievances. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I was in, like, my personal story with January was that I was in Almaty just the day before all these crazy events happened, and I saw some protesters were on the streets demanding the release of political prisoners, and they were followed by police and probably some security services in civil clothes. And it seemed normal to me because, like, people protest nowadays a bit more freely here. But then I had to fly back, and when I read the news, I just read the news that the airport was captured, and I was like, what the heck? I was there just 1 day ago and everything was normal. But I think, to me, it's essentially a social issue because there is a strong sense of injustice that such a rich country with so many natural resources, oil, gas, coal, whatever, you name it, and people live very poorly in those extracting areas. They die at their work, they are paid miserably, they're owned by foreign companies, whether it's Chinese oil companies, American, Russian, whatever, and they essentially don't have the right to protect their labor laws, any kind of laws. And it's kind of, it started in the west of the country, in Zhanaozen, which is a symbolic city, where in 2011 there was a protest of oil workers and they were shot. And this region is known for its solidarity among the workers. They all know how hard it is to work in these extracting industries, and that's why we saw a lot of solidarity protests of other workers after Zhanaozen people went out to protest. And then it spread across the country. And then somehow some other weird people came and something happened. I still don't know what happened. And I think when coming to the second part of your question, I agree with Bhavna that we shouldn't have already set lens on how to look and study and analyze Kazakhstan and other countries, because it might not work anymore. The reality now is much more complex, and we need to look at all the possible options, and especially I would point out to sociological institutes, because they have been under government control. The results were not allowed to go to public, for example, and we need to pay more attention to those local sociological institutes that are trying to work independently and do their research, and they can tell what is the level of tension in society, because all this time we just didn't know, and that's why we were surprised that it was like that, like a explosion of public unrest.
Thank you, absolutely. Right, I'm going to switch track a little bit. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the screen, from our virtual attendees, and do a couple more from the floor, and that'll be it, I'm afraid. I won't get through everybody, but firstly from the great John Roberts, probably for you, Annette, because it's an energy question, as I say, if you others don't mind. What are the prospects for further Russian disruptions to Kazakh energy revenues, and what measures can Kazakhstan take to direct exports to alternative markets? And also, how realistic are the prospects for a major redistribution of energy revenues to benefit much broader sections of Kazakh society? Been here before. Annette.
Okay. Well, I'm really lucky today. I have the actual experts asking me the questions that they should be asking themselves.
Yeah, I can see that.
So, I mean, obviously, I've mentioned already twice, it's really, as I say, a question for the conference that we are going to have on the 1st of December.
I'll do it again later,
yeah. Yeah, the development of these alternative transport routes. And I mean, we know that there's so much that needs to be done before they become viable. But of course, now is the time to do it, obviously. We have, the main advantage of the route at present is that it bypasses Russia. But the ferry crossings on the Caspian and Black Seas are slow and costly. Turkey's rail route is underdeveloped. So much investment is needed to bring this route up to speed. But there's never been a time like now. And Kazakhstan really has the opportunity to become an alternative transit hub. And I think this is something that that Tokayev has absolutely seized. And interestingly, I think he's handling the foreign policy with much greater adroitness than he is the domestic situation, despite the complexity of it all. I mean, he's a constant diplomat after all. But the domestic problems he's not going to be able to solve. But here we see that there really is progress being made, but I think it's going to be very, very slow. And we know that there are more, that with the problems affecting the CPC, we know that the middle corridor is now in much greater demand. We also know that there are tremendous problems with it. So we'll see what comes of that in terms of investment, I think in the very near future.
Thank you very much, Annette. I'll move swiftly on, but that's terrific. And you are actually as great an NG expert as John in a very different way, since area studies focus. So I think it's entirely legitimate. I'll take a question from Anna Chernova on screen, probably for Jerimo and Bhavna. Anna says, what role do the speakers see for international institutions, like the OSCE, the UN, the Council of Europe, in challenging elite capture and supporting democracy and justice? Are these institutions doing enough and at the right time? Bhavna.
Thank you. These international institutions, I would say, Council of Europe is not really, Kazakhstan is not part of it, and it's, but it's the OSCE that has been very actively engaged, the OSCE election monitoring mission. Incidentally, I don't know what kind of election monitors are being sent by OSCE to the
They are sending a full mission.
They are sending a full mission, yeah. But the mission, we can almost predict what they are going to conclude. I think the conclusions are probably already written. They just need to be revised. That there'll be, on the whole, there's greater transparency, but there were still some violations in this. But not the discrimination, but violations or whatever the procedural things which happen, they happened before the election. So there is already there's no level playing field. The incumbent has all the advantages. So I think the short answer is that these international institutions need to make sure that they appear credible, that they do not simply buy into the governmental rhetoric of stability and safe security and all those things, and not be unduly impressed by what Tokayev is doing in terms of speaking out against Russia, and also because this is the weapon of the authoritarian leaders, that we have external threat and we are doing everything to protect the domestic stability. So
we've certainly been here before the OSCE. I completely agree. Anything on multilaterals, Adjira?
Well, I think I agree with Bhavna, and also I personally have seen that all these institutions and they give grants to local civil society organizations that then they use these grants to, for example, do some trainings or educate independent monitor observers. But essentially, there is not much power that they have to influence the development of democracy and justice in Kazakhstan. I think it should come from bottom up, and it takes time.
Understood. Right, let's move on. John, please.
Thank you, James. I think there's maybe another question for Annette, so sorry to work you so hard, Annette. Back to the multi-vector foreign policy. How sustainable do you think this really is? It sort of feels to me that we haven't mentioned the US at all. It feels to me as though there's been a loss of interest in Washington, in Kazakhstan, after the withdrawal from Afghanistan. For most of this year, we had no US ambassador in post. I believe he is there now. Tokayev went to the UN General Assembly in September, but I'm not aware that there was any high-level meeting bilaterally. So if the US is less motivated to help maintain this multi-vector framework, does it really stay in place?
First of all, let me say that I agree with your assessment about the US. I think that it has put Kazakhstan in a bit of a back burner now. But by the same token, we have so many other takers, so many other countries courting Kazakhstan like never before. I mean, it really is astonishing when you look at the way in which the very words of the Turkish president echoed those of China. And again, the situation with China is much more complicated. There's a lot more to be unpacked there as to why it has thrown its support behind Kazakhstan, why it will not counter Russia messing with the export of crude oil on world markets. So I think, wait, let me just go back to recall what your question is. So yeah, so is the multi-vectoring going to, without the United States, is it feasible? I think it very much is at this point, particularly when you're talking about players like Turkey, like the EU, and China all coming together to support multi-vectoring for their own reasons, and Kazakhstan as well. So I think there's a much better shot actually at this going to plan than at any sort of domestic reform actually.
Yeah, thank you very much. For what it's worth, I mean, I was in Washington 2 weeks ago. I had some meetings with staffers on the Hill, and I think Kazakhstan must have been about number 50 in the list of priorities for midterms and the war, et cetera, So it's definitely not on their agenda, I'm sorry to say. Do you have anything to add on the internet? No, okay, let's move on, actually. Yannick, please.
Yannick Wysocki, Sigrid Rousing Trust. Thank you for the presentations. 2 quick questions. One, everyone spoke about the demand for change, especially among young people in Kazakhstan. Has there been any emergence of, in the absence of ability to start political parties or register political parties, are there any emergence of any other movements or civil society groups since January?
Yep.
And is there any difference in relations with the other Central Asian states? Okay.
Great.
Okay, I'll answer.
Yeah.
The emergence of movements and parties have been going on even before January events. It's just that the authorities did not register officially. They did not allow to register officially those movements. And just recently we have seen the release to home arrest one activist, Jambulat Mamai, who was the leader of one political movement that was quite like gaining popularity. And when we were talking about the political reforms, it was one of the points that the political parties will have much easier procedure for registration and et cetera. But so far to this day, we still see that no genuine political movement or party has been registered in Kazakhstan. And the second question, can you remind me?
Was it about the differences with other Central Asian states?
Yeah, I see that there is a closer regional cooperation, not on, I don't know about the government level, but in terms of just local population, people in Kazakhstan are more interested in Central Asian states now. In Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, they go there to travel, to just tourism, to experience other Central Asian countries. And it wasn't the case before. I would say maybe it was somewhat kind of the attitude, like we didn't even think about other Central Asian countries before in Kazakhstan, and now it's like closer regional cooperation, and we're just starting to explore what is there in other countries. And and I think it's an inevitable process, and there will be closer ties among the people, among the businesses as well, and while kind of staying away from Russia.
Emergence?
Yeah, political parties. We know the whole history that whereby independent attempts to create some form of independent political parties, I'm not even calling them opposition, have been stymied by the government, and most of the people who tried this and then became opposition have been exiled, killed, sidelined, co-opted, put in jail, or they have just decided to withdraw from the political sphere. So this summer when I was there, and people knew that elections are coming and it will follow the usual trend, the presidential election first, and everything is consolidated, and then the parliamentary elections. So Bulat Abilov, who has been an opposition and part of the Akshol and other movements, so he had been, I don't know what he's doing now, but he was actively talking about recreating a party. But at the same time, much younger people, they just said these are the same old people. Nothing is going to ever come out of these things, and we have no faith in this. So what I see is that the political parties will be allowed to register as we approach the Majlis elections. And then the usual government trick about, in order to deter the coming together of different views under one umbrella on one platform, they will create this pluralism. So they'll allow 3, 4, 5 parties to register so that none of them are really visible. And for most people, it makes no difference what these parties are. So they won't allow one single different groups to coalesce under one single umbrella.
Okay, here's a plan. It's 10, 11 past. I'm going to take 3 questions together and we'll just pick and choose from them, okay? And that way we'll get...
James, if I could just say something quickly about them, I'll be very quick.
Okay, yeah.
I just wanted to add something there. Because I think it's important, it allows us to look at this panel sort of in a holistic sense.
Yeah.
When I listened to Igarim and Bhavna's presentations, all 3 of us focused on this generational shift, where the younger generation sees themselves as agents of change. We all focused on the unfulfilled promise of reforms that this younger generation in particular is feeling. And third, that really we shouldn't be surprised if a situation appears in the future of unrest, of protests that are unforeseen as a result of these particular points that all 3 of us have made. And this relates to the gentleman's questions about any other parties. And so I just want to emphasize here that if genuine opposition parties are allowed registration, that would be very much a true hallmark of change in Kazakhstan. We've got the parliamentary elections coming up, and what we'll see is the same old pro-government parties being registered.
Okay, good summing up as well. Thank you very much indeed. So 3 quick questions, Paul, Katya and Alex.
Actually, mine's been answered.
Yours was the energy question, I suspect. Yep.
No,
it wasn't. Okay,
that was the last one.
Wrong guess. Katya, please.
Thanks, James. Katya CPAM. I wonder if there is any reliable data, polling data on public attitudes towards the war in Ukraine and towards Russia in general, but particularly towards Russia's-led organizations like the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And I wonder if there maybe has been any shift since January.
Okay, great. Alex?
Thank you very much. I want to ask about the Russian emigres, the people who predominantly have fled the draft. Is there a sufficient number there? Are they just keeping their heads down, or are they potentially, given that they are oppositionistic or at least anti-governmental in their attitude, are they possibly going to form some sort of opposition type force? Or is there any such potential within Kazakhstan for them to be active? Given that there is already a Russian population there, and perhaps for the later session also, is there a possibility for them to influence the economy?
Okay, interesting. I haven't considered that last part. Okay, Adrian, please.
I will start with the last question.
Sure.
I think that what we've seen, there were several waves of Russian migrants coming to Kazakhstan, and the last wave when Putin announced partial mobilization, it's basically any man who can get to the Kazakh border would go. And there is a difference between the waves, and the last wave, I think we have seen a lot of people who can actually support war in Ukraine. We have seen people coming to Almaty, for example, cafes with Putin's T-shirt or some other, like they were openly talking about invading Ukraine and openly talking about Kazakhstan being part of Russia. And this, of course, creates a lot of anxiety among local population. But we have also seen other Russians coming that wanted to help somehow socially, economically to the hosting country. And it's quite a mix. There is no particular bigger picture of who is coming, but the last wave is, of course, more, I would say, even not IT specialists, but other people who just had no choice. They just fled out of desperation, indeed. And we will see how it will develop in the future. But right now, it's still evolving, and we don't have actually proper statistics that counts how many people actually stayed in Kazakhstan, because we have only statistics that shows how many entered the country. But in general, the data shows that at least half of the Russian migrants have left the country, so they viewed Kazakhstan as a transit country. And the second part of your question about the activism, I haven't seen much of the activism from people coming from Russia. Maybe because they don't view Kazakhstan as a safe place to do their activism, because given that politically Kazakhstan is still very close to Russia, I know that some Russian people who are in Kazakhstan, they were very nervous that they might be deported back to Russia while in Kazakhstan, so they were keeping very low profile. Some other Russian activists, they actually protested, but on the wrong cases, like against horse meat, for example, and something like that. So yeah.
Polling data?
Polling data. I had one article, but I don't remember now who did it. I will try to find it and I can give it to you in person.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I have something to say about the Russians coming in, because I'm also following that event, and in 2 weeks I'll be in Kazakhstan. So, but before that, the question about CSTO and Eurasian Economic Union. A lot of Russians who are now coming in, it's easy for them, if you're part of Eurasian Economic Union, to move from one country to another and stay without requiring a registration up to 90 days and no work authorization. So Eurasian Economic Union, which appeared a virtual structure, political instrument of Russia rather than something available to people, is suddenly feel that ordinary people are engaging and using some of its the provisions. So that might, and prior to this, people in Kazakhstan were debating that Kazakhstan should maybe even leave Eurasian Economic Union, because the point in aligning with a sanction-ridden declining economy, and Belarus that is tagging along. So about Russians in Kazakhstan, we don't know the numbers. Many have gone to Turkey or gone back. There's this view that significant number of them who have arrived are IT professionals who can run their online business. Others have simply fled from the border areas with backpack and suitcase because they belong to the less privileged, less qualified strata. So there's a whole mix of them. There is also there's data on how many thousands of companies have relocated from Russia, and also international companies have relocated to Kazakhstan from Russia. So these are all in Almaty, Astana. I think more than the numbers, the local discourse about how these people are perceived is very important. So you have one group of people who are welcoming the Russians for the Kazakh hospitality and saying, we are not going to behave the way you have behaved towards us as colonizers, that we have the dignity and we know so there is that going on. There are other people, and I follow these discussions in social media, and I was surprised to see somebody who as an economist I respected, come out with these figures about thousands of Russians who have swarmed in, and once again they're colonizing us. So there's that kind of arousing national sentiment and immediately associating Russians with that. And just the final point is, and that the nationalist-minded people are also, and others also, and that's also true. You said people wearing Putin T-shirts, so they look at these kinds of people and they say that there are a lot of vatniki, as the internet meme referred to person who supports Putin and Krymnash campaign. Just one quick thing I'll say, I remembered when I was in Kazakhstan and I had applied for a local identification card, EIN, which allows you to get a local bank card and everything, makes life much easier. When I went to this EIN office, 90% of people who were applying for identification card were Russians. And there's some data which say that about 200,000 have applied for it in last year. So there are foreigners among them, also people like me and maybe Uzbekistan and others. But vast majority of these are Russians. So even if there are 100,000 or others, that shows. And one sentence that there is an automatic assumption that these Russians have some political objectives. Most of them want to find affordable housing, place to stay. What are they going to do with their families? They're not into this kind of political mobilization or anything.
To avoid a draft, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And there's no one like you, by the way, Bhavna. Annette, I will, last opportunity perhaps to say anything you like about Russian emigres.
I'll be very quick because I know that everybody's coffee break.
Yes.
So just two very quick points, because I think I made the more important point in the previous question, that we really need to keep our eye on the unfulfilled promises of reform and the effect that this is going to be having on society. But with regard to this set of questions, CSTO, definitely a waning force, and Kazakhstan is in the process of trying to strengthen its really very poor armed forces, and we'll be looking to doing that more to China and Turkey. That's the first point. The last point I'll make is with regard to support for the war. A poll came out, I would say maybe 2 or 3 months ago, that's been often cited, that shows this tremendous amount of support for Russia amongst the Kazakh population. And I just really have my doubts about that. I don't think it's accurate. The figures are overblown. But what I do think that we are seeing, and that hasn't been mentioned yet, is a growing ethnic divide. Obviously, ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, even Kazakhs who perhaps rely on Russian media, are indeed more influenced by that. And so we have those, that 20% of the population who is perhaps more pro-Putin's war, and a polarization that we're seeing with the rest of the population that is increasingly becoming much more pro-Ukraine. And I'll leave it there.
And a fantastic, fascinating point to end on, and an absolutely stonking session, ladies and gentlemen. I'm actually quite staggered by it. I really am. So no pressure, Kate, for the next one. Listen, we'll have. So what's time? We'll begin again, ladies and gents, especially on screen, at 11:35 prompt. So it's a pretty lightning quick 12-minute coffee break. We do have to take a break. I think it's only fair, but just very briefly, please, my profound thanks. Please join me with my profound thanks to Adrian, Annette, get well soon, Annette, and Bhavna. Thank you.
Welcome everybody to the second session of today's meeting on Kazakhstan. In the second session, we're going to be looking at the kind of economic outlook and governance and transparency. We're very excited to have two guests from Almaty, and thank you. I will introduce you in a second. But as we heard this morning, President Tokayev's idea of a new Kazakhstan seems to be very much a work in progress, and the very personalistic political economy that's centered on the Nazarbayev family has clearly not been fully dismantled, nor are we really seeing many new independent faces in government to signal a change of attack. The failure to reform the economy for the benefit of the Kazakh population was a major contributing factor to the January unrest. And without major reform, there really is a kind of real risk of a repeat of those tragic events. So this morning it's really great to have three very accomplished speakers who will look at the economy in more detail, those reforms which have been undertaken, those which haven't, the business environment for investors, and also really importantly, governance and transparency going forward. So to begin with, we are joined on the right by Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, one of Kazakhstan's most respected economists, who's the managing partner at Almaty-based economic consultancy EMCG, and he's also the founder of economist.kz, a very well-regarded economic analysis website, and he also has a very popular Telegram channel, which I advise you all to follow. We're then going to have Benjamin Godwin, who's on my right, and quick disclaimers that I work with Ben at PRISM, but he's very much been selected on his own many merits, so just putting that out there. And he has spent 7 years working in Kazakhstan. He's one of the leading Western experts, in my opinion, on the Kazakh economy and business environment for foreign investors. He works both with direct and portfolio investors looking to understand complex macro, regulatory and counterparty risk. And finally, at the end of today's session, we have Aida Yegubayev, who has had an extremely successful international legal career and is chairman of the board of directors at Transparency Kazakhstan, which is a branch of the well-known international anti-corruption organization, Transparency International. He's also a managing partner at Almaty-based law firm Voronov and Partners. And he's one of the leading commentators on topics such as anti-corruption legislation and also the asset recovery programs. So there's two at the moment which are in process in Kazakhstan, one's government-led and one's NGO-led. And I advise you to listen to his brilliant YouTube interviews, which have taken place over the last couple of weeks. But thank you to everyone for joining today. Kassym-Jomart, can I turn over to you to start, please?
Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak at such a distinguished panel to such a great audience. Let me start. I will focus on three main topics. First is the challenges that we face now, and I will talk about all challenges and new challenges that have emerged during this year. Then I will talk about what to expect post-election that are coming next coming week. And the next I will finalize with my ideas on what can be done. So first, challenges in Kazakhstan, we can say that the old challenges are still remaining, namely it's a high dependence on oil revenue and oil funds. It's declining budget revenues, especially post-pandemic lockdown that has affected more significantly small enterprises. There are growing social expenses of state budget that I will talk more about in coming sections. There are notable expenses on government debt, which is around 8% of total expenditures of state budget. There is a high presence of state in the economy and a still large number of inefficient state-owned enterprise. And so one of the pressing social issues, in my view, is around 1 million kids in Kazakhstan. They live in families with income level below poverty, mostly in rural areas. And I think it's a very slowly ticking time bomb for Kazakhstan that we should take into account. So now let me talk about the challenges that new emerging challenges that we are facing this year. So first of all, of course, it's inflation. It's a global trend, but in Kazakhstan, it's also accelerated. It's around 18%. And the central bank rate is has been hiked recently to 16%. So there is still a big need for reforms. Mostly these reforms would be unpopular in economic and social spheres. And we see that probably in the last 3 years, since we have a new president, these unpopular reforms haven't been addressed. Another problem with the current administration, in my view, is that it's running out of popular reforms and promises. So the last bucket of promises was given away for this election, and one of the most prominent and the one that can give you a sense of the local situation is that President's administration has promised to allocate 50% of investment interest from oil fund to people when they reach 18 years old. So that's a promise of a future income in the next 18 years, which in my view signals that promises regarding the current time have already finished. Another challenge that I see in this year is also the population growth that last year has surpassed 4%, and for the first time the population was growing faster than the economy. And that's the issue that hasn't been addressed yet. And we have a high percentage of young people not in education, employment or training, so-called NEET population. Was around 10% by the World Bank accounts in 2016, and I believe since then it hasn't been declining much. In Kazakhstan, we have around 20% of total population is people in the age bracket of 14 to 28%. So it's a quite high percentage of young people, and it's the problem of unemployment among young people is also a pressing issue for the government. Then, of course, this year, one more challenge emerged with sanctions regime against the largest trade partner, Russia, and subsequently the Customs Union and the Eurasian Economic Union that Kazakhstan is part of. So let me move on to what to expect after the elections. So these elections will give mandate for president for reforms for the next 7 years. And the biggest question is how this mandate will be used. Will it be used to conduct unpopular but necessary economic and difficult political reforms? Or, in my view, more likely, no radical reforms will be conducted and government will continue to use windfall profits to ensure loyalty through employment in state sector and social payments. It will continue towards the scenario of the extreme scenarios of Turkmenistan, Libya, and other autocratic regimes, which provided very generous social packages for its people in exchange for loyalty. What still bothers me after 3 years of presidents being in the office and almost 1 year since January events is that there has been still no clear economic program announced. What we see is a mostly focus on solving current problems, short-term planning, ensuring to capture assets of Nazarbayev's family. So we can say that the Kazakhstan still lacks long-term vision when it comes to its economic development. Moreover, there are contradictory signals that I see this year. First of all, it's a selling of some state assets, which has been conducted not very transparently. And on the other hand, the new state fund was created. It's called Kazakhstan Halkına, which means for the people of Kazakhstan. And its operations is also not transparent. Basically, all the large enterprises have to give their shares, provide their shares to this fund. And what it means is that these companies now refuse to fund the NGOs or social projects that they've been funding before that. And basically, we see that the state presence, even in the NGO sector, has increased. Economic reforms that needs to be done definitely is the price regulation, especially for utilities services. But on the other hand, we know that the January events were triggered by the same price regulation issue when the prices for gas have been a little bit liberalized. And the other economic reform is demonopolization, but it also has problems because there are a lot of interest of local oligarchs and crony capitalism. Political reforms, of course, everybody knows that they are still needed. They're still the same. It's a decentralization. President's team have announced that it is planning to do elections of the heads of regional administrations, oblasts, but we'll see how it goes. Still topical issue is the freedom of speech and gatherings and the political prisoner. I think that the team, the president's team will focus during the next 7 years on investment attraction, probably on the sell-off of state assets, but it's not quite obvious if it will be transparent and open for foreign players. For example, there is a fund for toxic assets, which has assets of around $1 billion. Mostly that was gathered from all the banks that went bankrupt. So the question here is, what will be the source of foreign investment? Will it be China, who is stepping up while Russia is being sanctioned? Or will Kazakhstan become an attractive investment destination for Western funds or some Arab states? So during this year, Tokayev had a very busy schedule of business trips to meet investors. So it was investment round in the US, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, but still no big deals have been announced as a result of this tour. In my view, there is also a chance for the next 7 years that there could occur a situation where the government will try to renegotiate current investment contracts, despite right now President is talking about saying in all of his interviews that this will not be the case. But we see that Chevron, for example, have already launched its $250 million private equity fund to invest in business, in small and medium enterprises in Kazakhstan. And the operations of this fund is also not very transparent. So it also leads to some funding some projects that are maybe pointed out from Astana or to establish connections with the new administration. We also see that in the region there was a recent case of nationalization of Kumtor in Kyrgyzstan, which provides a ground for ideas in Kazakhstan, especially given that the current administration has run out of popular reforms. Then it's always an option, to nationalize some assets. And the last part is what can be done. In my view, first of all, of course, there is a big need for political reforms, basically to ensure the development of private sector and market economy in Kazakhstan. In more details, I would say that the tax reform is needed to stimulate the consolidation and size growth of business through public procurement. We have around 5,000 large enterprises, 5,000 medium-sized enterprises, and 99% of the rest enterprises are small businesses, mostly micro businesses. So it's a very small number of enterprises that are interesting to foreign investors. Of course, more economic freedom and less state share in the economy is needed. So the reform over Samruk Kazana state sovereign fund, which Tokayev has announced in the beginning, but now he gave 3 months to prepared the plan for their restructuring, then extended to 6 months, and now it's off the table and there is no further discussion about this. Of course, this year we faced a big issue with export routes for Kazakh oil, so the CPC problem, the oil discount, and there is a big issue with new routes that is overshadowing all local problems, of course, for the government. Also talking about the war impact on Kazakhstan, there is a logistics bottleneck right now because most of our businesses were using Russian ports and Russian railways for the imports, and there is a clear need for alternative route. It might be a middle corridor, but still it will take some time to match the pipeline. Another opportunity that I see, given the current geopolitical situation, is integration in Central Asia. And as Aygerin previously said, it's becoming more of a trend right now that we can see. So the integration could provide new markets and routes for Kazakhstan's goods. And there is a clear need for import substitution with Russia being under the sanctions. It could probably become China or Turkey because Kazakhstan is a big importer of finished goods. There is a need for large-scale program to prepare local companies to receive foreign investments, and there is a big problem with KYC and PEP issues. So currently, large enterprise in Kazakhstan, they don't abide with these rules. And EBRD and IFC has been active here to invest in local large companies, but they were bound by these KYC and PEP issues. Then, of course, there is an opportunity to attract talents from Russia and Ukraine, given the situation right now. And Kazakhstan is becoming a safe haven for IT specialists. Just recently, large, previously Russia-based InDriver company has reallocated its main office to Kazakhstan. It's around 600 headcount of IT specialists who are now based in Almaty and Astana. And of course, I expect that there are some opportunities with relocating the business and physical plants from Russia to Kazakhstan. For example, Toyota and Nissan has announced that they will be shutting down and selling off their plants in Russia. So that's on the brighter side, on the opportunities. Thank you for the attention. We'll be glad to hear your questions.
Thank you, Kassym-Han. As ever, just brilliant, very detailed kind of overview and analysis, 360 degrees of the challenges facing the Kazakh economy. And I think it's going to dovetail nicely with what Ben's got a favorite kind of short-term, long-term problem you were talking about with the price regulation for utilities, and how can the Kazakh administration move beyond the difficulties of the socio-economic challenges and liberalize various markets, making it more painful for the Kazakh population. So thank you, Kassym-Han, and I'm going to turn to Ben.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Kassym-Han. I think to start off with perhaps the bad news, the January events and the war in Ukraine have clearly been negative for Kazakhstan. There is some talk, and Kassym-Han mentioned the possibility of Kazakhstan benefiting from companies relocating from Russia into Kazakhstan. And we certainly, we were recently in Almaty speaking to a couple of companies that were moving some of their operations from Russia into Kazakhstan. But generally, it's created a cloud across the whole region, this situation. And we can see that, for example, with the collapse in the market capitalization of some of Kazakhstan's blue chip companies. I'm thinking here Kazatomprom, Halyk Bank, and Kaspi, the fintech company, all listed on the London Stock Exchange. Kaspi, which is really a real success story for Kazakhstan in the fintech world, a bank that turned into a great fintech company, was had a share price of $118 before the January events. It collapsed to around $40 by about March, and it's only sort of started to recover. It's at $66, I looked at it this morning. And so we can see that investor sentiment towards Kazakhstan has really suffered as a result of these events. And I think it's really because for investors, two myths have been busted about Kazakhstan. One, that Kazakhstan is internally stable. I think there was a view that while Kazakhstan is an autocratic state, largely around a one-person rule, generally society and elite relations were stable. But the January events have proven that that's not the case. Society is able to disrupt the country, as are elite relations. And the second myth is that Kazakhstan's multi-vector foreign policy has enabled Kazakhstan to shield itself from instability within the region. When things were quiet, we were able to talk about that, but actually, frankly, that risk of Russia has always been there. And so we really need to be thinking about what are the concerns now? How are we going to look at this region from an investment point of view? And how is the economy going to develop from now on? I think the major concern, and Kassym Khan touched on this, is security. There's obviously, and we touched on this in the first panel, there's obviously the risk of Kazakhstan-Russia relations breaking down, but there's also, of course, the focus on the CPC pipeline. CPC has been disrupted by the Russians on at least one occasion, and certainly there's a lot of confusion about what specifically is happening with repair works around CPC, whether they're being intentionally delayed or not delayed. But frankly, that is a critical risk towards Kazakhstan that investors should be thinking about. It's critical, obviously, for the oil industry, but as Kassym Khan said, the oil industry is critical to the Kazakh economy. It's a huge part of the national budget. A lot of revenues from the oil industry are redispersed across the economy to fund the agriculture industry, the construction industry, and all other parts of the economy. So if there were to be disruption of CPC, that would be a huge challenge for Kazakhstan economically, possibly very similar to the early 1990s. We talked about the middle corridor. Of course, Kazakhstan is now forced to diversify away from Russia. There are critical inputs going into the Kazakh economy that need to be thought about. Actually, Russia in terms of rail is very important, but there's also the Volga-Don Canal, which links the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea. A lot of large machinery is shipped through that into the Caspian Sea and on into Kazakhstan, so gas turbines for the oil industry, for example, for Chevron's future growth project for Tengiz. But also those of you that are interested in decarbonization, if wind turbines are not coming from China, they're coming from Europe, and they're coming via the Black Sea, the Volga-Don Canal, into the Caspian Sea. And so Kazakhstan's plans for decarbonization rely very heavily on that route through Russia. Uranium. Many of you will know that Kazakhstan is a critical producer of uranium. 40% of the world's production comes from Kazakhstan. That is currently exported via Russia, via rail. Obviously, it's a highly controlled substance. Kazatomprom, the national uranium company, has been working to diversify these export routes. There is a route through the middle corridor, through the South Caucasus, but that's proving extremely challenging, and we're watching as the company tries to move those exports through the middle corridor. And of course, every other company, be it industrial services, relies to a certain extent on inputs from outside of Kazakhstan, which are now having to be redirected through the middle corridor. So we're actually taking a lot of time to think about the challenges of this route. Clearly, a huge amount of investment is needed to increase capacity. It's not clear where this investment is going to come from at this point, whether Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, for example, have the capacity to supply that investment. And then security of the middle corridor is a major risk for Kazakhstan as well. We see consistent tensions between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And if anything, there's a strong likelihood that these tensions are going to increase, and we could see another outbreak of military violence in the Caucasus. And of course, Azerbaijan has some very tense relations with a lot of its European partners, particularly France. So French companies looking to move things in and out of the middle corridor to get to Central Asia are going to have trouble crossing Azerbaijan. So these trade routes are going to be a real challenge for Kazakhstan. And if anything, it's simply just increasing costs, adding to inflation within the country, which kind of takes us to the second point, socioeconomic tensions. We've talked about it in the I agree and raised it in the first section, Kassym Khan too. Social economic tensions, really because of the January unrest, are really slowing down a lot of the economic reform that the government needs to do. I slightly differ from Kassym Khan in the point of view that I think there is an understanding and appreciation of what needs to be done in terms of market reform, reducing the role of the state within the economy, demonopolization. I think certainly in theory, in principle, there is an understanding within the government that this has to take place. And actually, since 2019, President Tokayev has spoken quite a lot about a lot of these challenges. And it's been nice to see actually that the president at times has recognized that the state is not necessarily the solution to all of the problems when the state already occupies such a huge role in the economy, and it's about developing the private sector. But the reforms that Kassym Khan mentioned are extremely painful. Removing price regulation, price liberalization, that means utility costs to average households are gonna grow tremendously. And we've seen this already, an attempt at a staggered liberalization of petroleum gas prices triggered the January unrest. So in principle, the government is committed to removing price regulation for commodities, setting up commodity exchanges, but in practice, it's very difficult for the government to push this through given the socio-economic tensions. Another issue is privatization. There is an understanding in principle that the role of the state needs to be lowered, particularly around service companies that are subsidiaries of state-owned enterprises, to create a genuine market, create competition and efficiency within the market. But privatization, of course, means job layoffs. It means people losing their jobs very likely. A lot of the strike action, and we monitor strikes on a monthly basis, keep a track of how many are happening. A lot of the strikes that are taking place now are from companies that were privatized 5 years ago, and their workforces having certain conditions run out after 5 years and demanding that the state re-nationalize these companies. So a lot of the industrial action has actually been against the privatization program. We could do the same for budget reform. We're getting to a point now where nearly 50% of the annual budget is spent on some kind of social program. That's clearly unsustainable. But at the same time, how do you do budget reform? How do you stop dipping into the national fund? How do you stop increasing borrowing on international markets when you have such a socioeconomic crisis within the government, within the country? So really, there's this gap between what the government knows needs to be done and what the government is willing to do. And in many cases, we see the government actually doubling down on social benefits, doubling down on state subsidies, doubling down on fiscal stimulus because it sees the risk of unrest. The other thing is that we've noticed that government decision-making has broken down to a certain degree since January. First, there's the whole question of who runs Kazakhstan. I think it's clear now that Tokayev has formally taken control of Kazakhstan and informally is gradually taking control of Kazakhstan as well. But he has a very small group of trusted advisors around him. It's a very close-knit group, very closed, and it's not quite clear who is advising him and how that's translating into policy decisions. So we're seeing quite a few curious policy decisions. For example, the one that surprises me is to ban exports of gas. It would seem to me that the best way to get more investment in the gas industry, to get more gas being produced, is to offer investors and gas producers access to export markets as a device of bringing, given the high export prices that are offered to people, that would be a great way of stimulating investment in the economy. But it seems the short-term view is that the government sees that, okay, crikey, we might have a gas shortage. The best way we can stop the gas shortage is by halting all gas exports. So it's not quite clear who is making what decisions where within the government. And at the lower levels of government, at the ministerial level, we see a very high rotation of people coming in and out. We see a lot of people that are perhaps very well qualified as technocrats, but don't necessarily have a kind of political weight or a political mandate to drive certain changes through. And then we see the government, to a large extent, in a sort of wait and see mode. So we've obviously had the fallout from the January events, and then we had constitutional reforms in the summer. Now we have a presidential election coming up in this month. And so a lot of what we've seen in the government is basically senior people in the government trying not to do too much, just to wait and see what's happening, which way the wind is going to blow. So certainly for interlocutors interacting with the government, it's been quite a frustrating period to understand where this government is going, what decisions are going to be made. An example of that would be the Foreign Investors Council. Last year, there were quite a few agreements made by the government of Kazakhstan with foreign investors as to changes that would be made, for example, to the environmental code, on fiscal matters. Those changes have not been enacted, and in some cases there's been talk of actually reversing those changes. So where we have seen progress, because the government has changed, because senior people don't quite know the direction in which the government is going to go, whether they'll still be in their jobs perhaps, come the elections, we have seen a reversal of some of the positive movement that we did see initially under Tokayev. We certainly hope that with a new mandate, a new presidential term, the president will appoint a government that is very much in his image, that has a mandate to deliver on some of the promises that the president has made for reform. And so some of these issues around decision-making, getting things done, getting things implemented, may certainly improve. A couple of other points. A concern that we're starting to have is that we are starting to see some of those perhaps corrupt relations returning to Kazakhstan. There is a reforming of the elites. Certainly a lot of the patron-client relations that we've traditionally seen in the past have been broken down, particularly around the production and trading of commodities. But we are starting to see suggestions that some of these relations are returning, perhaps with new people coming in to manage these activities. Very nascent at the moment, but it's something that we are watching and we would clearly not like to see develop further. And there are some other areas of the economy that I wanted to highlight. I mentioned Kaspi Bank and fintech. That is an area which I think we're likely to see a lot of investment going forward. Kazatomprom and the Iranian industry is going to be more and more important. If anything, the move to decarbonization and clearly the war in Kazakhstan has made the global community look again at nuclear. We've seen obviously huge commitments by China over the last year or two for uranium. They're aiming to build something like 120 nuclear reactors by the end of the decade. Absolutely extraordinary. But we see Japan rethinking nuclear and other countries as well. That's a great opportunity for Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan is clearly looking to engage with the international community on that. Another area that I wanted to highlight is decarbonization. Kazakhstan has set quite an ambitious goal of decarbonizing by 2060. That will be an extraordinary target if it is able to be met. 70 to 80% of Kazakhstan's electricity is generated by coal at the moment. So moving from a coal economy, transitioning through gas into renewable energy in the next essentially 35 years is going to be a tremendous challenge for the country. But it is, again, an area where Kazakhstan is actively looking out towards particularly Europe and North America to engage with, as well as Japan and South Korea. And we're starting to see the growth of renewable energy and actually some nascent projects. During our last visit to Kazakhstan, there's been a lot of talk now, and actually I noticed this week or last week the World Bank just released a report on hydrogen. There are investors actively looking at the possibility of developing hydrogen within Kazakhstan. The advantage of these industries that I've set out, particularly fintech and the decarbonized industries, is that they do not have the baggage of the past. A lot of the problems of corruption and rent seeking that we saw in the past is because you have a large state enterprise, be it an oil field or a steel mill or something like that, that is state owned, and then you have actors around it that are able to leach the value out of that asset until you've bled the asset dry. The way that the decarbonized economy works is that it's highly decentralized. So we're talking about relatively small wind and solar projects, and also the way that wind and solar projects are structured through PPA agreements. People do not have the opportunity to sort of double their money overnight. They have to, wait 15, 20, 25 years to see a return on those assets. And certainly when we look at the players in the renewable energy sector, we do not see the same sort of clustered ownership around a certain group of people. So that's certainly a positive with Kazakhstan. But I think to conclude, I think I just want to say that I agree with Kassym that dealing with the socioeconomic conditions in Kazakhstan, and we see it to a certain degree in Europe now with the cost of living crisis, is the government's priority. And I think we have to accept that that's going to come second to economic reform, and it's going to come second to improvements to the investment climate. So in the short term, I do not see that the government is going to be able to effectively privatize, effectively liberalize commodity prices. That just doesn't seem to be on the cards. My only hope is that the government has set out those plans, and hopefully when the economic situation improves, Kazakhstan will be able to move more in that direction. Thanks, Kate.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. There's a lot to digest there, but yeah, a lot of myth busting as well, and that's, in these days of trying to sift through the rhetoric and the disinformation is extremely helpful. The ongoing theme is kind of uncertainty and also transparency. So I'm going to hand over now to Aydar, who's hopefully going to talk a bit about the asset recovery schemes going on, and also talk a bit about how we need more transparency and accountability in Kazakhstan from all players. Thank you.
Well, I was listening to the participants, and I've read the name of today's meeting. What can we expect from Tokayev's New Kazakhstan, and especially the bullet points of this session in the future. And it seems to be that the curiosity of those who ask this question is the curiosity of the observers who look at, processes and revolutions on a distant planet of Arrakis, and which is really interesting. And this reminded me of these words: "Oh, east is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet, till earth and sky stand presently at God's great judgment seat." Unfortunately, humanity sits down and discusses serious issues only when, earth and sky stand presently, and we seem to observe these processes right now. What happened in January, and then in what happened in January in Kazakhstan, and then February in Ukraine, and then since March, Russia is going to a very strange place. I think personally is the continuation of the Soviet Union collapse. And I will, I'm a lawyer, so I will do a disclaimer. I will not be objective, and I will say my humble opinion about the processes that are happening. In what happened in January actually is a cyclical repetition. It's a cycle. The same happened in December 2011 in Zhanaozen. The same happened in 1989 in Zhanaozen. Same happened in December of 1986 in Almaty. So basically, the power, the regime reaches the point when the people starts questioning the legitimacy. The legality is being used by a political regime in a similar way, like, you know, legality was being used by Michael Corleone. Michael Corleone had a fund called Immobiliare, and it was legal, you know, he became clean. Now we see that Nazarbayev has a fund called Jusan. Now it's in London. It seems to be, you know, perfectly legal. The system allows it. So the people right now raises the question of legitimacy, and legitimacy is becoming more important than legality. Starting from 11th of January, Tokayev made various promises, and he tried to show that he understands and he feels the pain of the people. He gathered oligarchs, and most of you probably know that, and he used the KBMG report on private equity, which stated, without, I think, naming specific names, that 162 persons own 55% of wealth in Kazakhstan. And that is a very, I think, deep question. And it is valid not only for Kazakhstan, it is also valid for many Western countries, including egalitarian countries of Scandinavian region, where very few own most of the wealth. And you know, Thomas Piketty, I think, describes it very well in his book called Capital in the 21st Century. Tokayev, unfortunately, already failed to fulfill some of the promises. And that is the old story for Kazakhstan, you know, unfulfilled promises. He promised not to touch the constitution, not to change it, and it has been amended this summer. He also promised to do a thorough investigation about the tortures and the killings in January. That didn't take place still. I do not possess accurate data as to how many suffered or died or were tortured. But as far as I know, there is only one case that reached the court. It is right now in regional court of Taldykurgan. There are 23 persons that suffered. 5 policemen apparently are under investigation, and only one of them is in prison. 4 were minors in terms of age. It's not clear how can Tokayev change the situation. Many of the facts has already been told before. I can only add that yesterday the case of former KNB, which is the new name for KGB in Kazakhstan, was transferred to court. The case of Mr. Masimov, who apparently has some sort of relation to the organization of January events. And also today, yesterday, during his meeting, Tokayev said that it's probably necessary to do a proper due diligence of the assets of Lakshmi Mittal, the metallurgical plant, because as Agirim Tulikhanova said, there were 5 people dead due to production accident recently, and it's not the first time. It doesn't matter whether January events were caused by organization or provocation, because someone from the participants of Prague Spring in 1968 said, you know, during similar accusations that it wasn't real, it was provocated. What she said is that it doesn't matter if this was organized. The people who actually went out on the streets were sincere. And I was in Almaty, and I really felt on 4th of January until probably 3 or 4 a.m. I felt the feeling of pride. It was like a celebration. Finally, people were filled. Streets were filled with people, and it was finally safe until 3 a.m. At 3 a.m. we had police forces, or maybe after midnight we had police forces, and then the shootings happened. The rest, The real reasons probably will never be known to us. It's something, it will be like a question who killed JFK. But it doesn't matter whether we will know. We know that sufferings and killings happened. Today's demands of the society are based on the imagination and narratives about equality, justice, and perspectives. How much Tokayev is driven by the interests of oligarchs, we don't know. But the fear is that there is that. I wrote down what is New Kazakhstan, in my personal humble opinion, and I thought of 7 elements. I thought that New Kazakhstan basically will be a cocktail consisting of the following ingredients. Number 1, existing state apparatus with limited capacity, because it's super presidential constitution, and they all have to follow the orders of the president, basically, more than they have to be independently professional. There is also, I think, lack of emotional intelligence with the state apparatus and bureaucrats. Number 2, new answers to the old social economic inequality problems. Number 3, significantly more active civil society, and also, the morale of the oligarchs. How much of the oligarchs will be able to overcome their greed and feel responsible for what happens in Kazakhstan? Number 4, pragmatic approach of the super majors in the oil industry, aka 7 sisters, as one called, because so far they are prioritizing excessive profits for their UBOs over social consequences for the country partners. Number 5, dialectic contradiction of Tokayev's personality. Now, Tokayev is a product of Nazarbayev's system. He grew, he was formed, and he reached high posts during Nazarbayev and due to Nazarbayev time. He probably perceives Nazarbayev as his teacher, and the time requires him to change that attitude, but apparently he's not ready. During his interview in January, he said that we shouldn't underestimate the role of Nazarbayev. He said the same about a week ago during his speech. On the other side of the balance, you see the interests of the people, and that the economics must be changed. The huge difference between Tokayev and Nazarbayev is his real higher education. He is an educated man, and he is also a professional. During his years of diplomacy, he saw Singapore and China. Let me remind you that GDP of China in 1980 was less than GDP of Spain. And Singapore also changed significantly during authoritarian regime. But I will differ from those speakers before me that concentrate and focus on foreign investments, because the same professor, Thomas Piketty, proved that the East Asian tigers, including Singapore, South Korea, etc., they made their jump not because of foreign investments, but because of internal accumulations of capital. And this is something that fails to happen so far. Number 6 is the new stronger role of Kazakhstan after apparently weakening of Russia. And number 7 is the growth of national patriotism, because the rhetorics that is being used or was used against Ukraine in Russia has a very similar flavor, although not as aggressive, as some rhetorics that we've heard from Russian politics. And this causes now growth of nationalism, and nationalism is becoming more of a positive term, like patriotism. For example, today I've seen in the news that a new bill is being offered in the parliament, that in order to get Kazakhstan citizenship, you need to know Kazakh language. Now, that was unthinkable even a year ago. A year ago, they suggested to have price tags in Kazakh, and some protectors of Russian culture thought that this is too much, and this is, attack of the Russian world. With regards to asset recovery, President Tokayev created 2 commissions, one on 23rd of February, one on 8th of June. It's not clear yet as to what specific results they are reaching, but they're counting the potential results in millions and billions tenge, when we know that according to World Bank, I think the estimates of cash flows caused by organized crime and corruption are something between $2 and $3.7 trillion. So the estimates that I've heard, independent estimates, are more over hundreds of billions of dollars. Right now, the commissions are closed from the society. They consist only of state employees. Headed the commission, the latest commission is headed by the general prosecutor. We don't know what is happening. But as I said today, what I thought was interesting, Tokayev said that he requests the due diligence of the investor, of foreign investor, how much investments were made, and whether they are proportionate and they adequate to the objectives of HSE and the interests of the employees. Maybe we see the first example of what is going to happen to oligarchs and foreign investors. When I quoted a poem by Kipling, I also wanted to entertain this idea. Maybe the DNA of kleptocracy lies in the contracts with mineral resources, on mineral resources, and international agreements about that. What I mean is the Energy Charter Treaty, which talks about mineral resources flowing from territories like Kazakhstan to Europe, but they're not really protecting the interests of the future of Kazakhstan. I found this findings by a lawyer of International Institute for Sustainable Development called Natalie Bernasconi-Osterwalder. She said that Energy Charter Treaty has no responsibilities for investors, and Energy Charter Treaty follows expansionist ambitions. And also I wanted to mention the very first, or maybe I'll mention all 3 production sharing agreements that are not non-transparent. So what we can discuss here, and what I offer maybe to discuss, is what international business can do, and what is the contribution that it has made to kleptocracy in Kazakhstan. Right now, in the files of Justice Departments of New York, there are documents that say that two top managers, Americans, gave bribes to two top officials of Kazakhstan. The result is that the top managers were punished, but Tokayev is not reacting, and this case is already more than 20 years old. I'm talking about Kazakhgate. The regime is not doing anything, towards of what it should do, maybe, towards Nazarbayev and his role. But also, the American legal system didn't do anything against Chevron, against Mobil, against those companies that participate in the oil contracts, who were officially in the judicial documents qualified, as corrupted. And the judge stated that these two top managers, two Americans, deprived Kazakh people from honest state service of top officials and also of good terms. So these contracts are not really win-win. There is no balance of interests. The oil companies are not really having serious initiative, serious intention of following a very good standard that is being suggested by EITI. What I mean is Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. It's very scientific, it's very academic. All you have to do is just use it. You can open the contract, you can make it transparent, and that will change things, because kleptocracy, corruption, is about greed, and greed is a constant thing for humanity. So in order to not to cherish the greed, but maybe try to limit it, you have to achieve balance of interest in the principal commercial contracts that are the sources of wealth for Kazakhstan. And these are the production sharing agreements, the 3 production sharing agreements, and the oil contracts in general. I think that could be a specific contribution that could be done in order to change stuff that is happening, and in order for the new Kazakhstan to be a better place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ida. As you can understand from his beautiful, articulate, kind of lyrical speech, why he's getting such a following on YouTube as well. So thank you for all the lyrical and the literature and the poetry that you brought into it. And a lot of food for thought. I think that's going to hopefully spur on some questions, and hopefully you might get a response to what you said. So now to go, has anyone in the room got questions first of all? I'll turn to you, Bryn.
Yeah, I have one question. Thanks very much. My name's Bryn. I work with Prism, and it's for Ida actually. And I'm just really interested by this, the concept of asset recovery, because you mentioned how Tokayev talked about the KPG private equity report, which says about how basically 100 or so individuals basically own, or at least own most of the wealth of Kazakhstan, and then he mentioned the report, but then he didn't mention the names. And then surely he knows the names. And at the same time, he talks, publicly about the amount of wealth that's been filtered abroad during the Nazarbayev period. But at the same time, he's only put, say, 2 close Nazarbayev figures in jail or under investigation and so on. And there seems to be somewhat a disconnect where he's talking publicly about these issues, but then his measures to actually tackle them quite limited. And I'm just wondering, what's your take on his strategy here? And if the amounts of money that have been filtered abroad are so huge, surely they have a chance to, revolutionize the Kazakh economy. These are huge sums of money. And as you say, they're, maybe even more important than foreign direct investment. And why isn't Tokayev more concerted in his efforts to repatriate these assets? And why is he adopting this strategy of talking publicly about these problems, yet at the same time, practically maybe not doing so much?
Well, as I said, there is dialectic contradiction in Tokayev, and maybe adding to your question, I can also recall that, for example, in 1986 in Philippines, President Corazon Aquino needed 26 days to issue 2 decrees. One is to arrest the assets of Marcos, the predecessor, to initiate the courts, judicial cases. Second is to attach the assets of Marcos and his associates and his relatives abroad. That was 26 days, and that wasn't fast enough. But today, I think we have technology on our side, and every cent is being recorded. I mean, the wire transfers. As to why, I think that his years as a diplomat in Singapore and China showed him the better side of a proper pace, and proper pace is necessarily instant action. Maybe he is willing to be consequential and consistent with his ideas, but not at a pace that will scare away the fish. Let me be romantic, if you will allow. Somebody already said something very important, that police and KNB, aka KGB, are independent bodies. And they're and this is post-Soviet country, which means we are police state. They're very powerful. The cognitive potential, that's snobbish to say, but cognitive potential of policemen is different than that of Tokayev. But they have the real power, so he has, and they are under control of some of the oligarchs. A lot of oligarchs may be appointed using their capital, these people. So perhaps he is not at the freedom to act as romantically and beautifully and fastly as Corazon Aquino, or maybe President Obasanjo in Nigeria, who declared that the family of his predecessor, Abacha, is a criminal group. Now, that's probably, going too far, bearing in mind the Kazakh mentality. But both President Obasanjo and President Corazon Aquino had personal motive. Their predecessor, Marcos killed the husband of Corazon Aquino, and Sani Abacha, the predecessor of Obasanjo, wanted to execute him. Actually, there is an interesting detail. At the very last moment, Transparency International appointed President Obasanjo as the executive director, and some say that saved him from dying. So they had personal motive. Maybe Tokayev's perception of himself as a good human being, as a loyal human being, is more important than the temptation to punish the Nazarbayev family. I can only speculate. I don't know the real answer. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to read out this kind of comment question again from John. I'm not sure who would like to answer it, but given that the decarbonised economy is less lootable and more decentralised, as Ben noted, and yet we see plenty of evidence regarding the reconsolidation of kleptocracy under Tokayev, as all panelists have noted, what kinds of ingenious financial engineering will be developed by professional service providers, many of them based in London, to ensure that a small number of people continue to hoard the lion's share of the country's wealth? Or should we be more optimistic? Any takers? Is it going to change?
Maybe Kassym-Khan can do it. Maybe he has a better data, if he agrees.
think, I mean, it almost answers itself.
Well, yeah, I just want to mention that in Kazakhstan, there is an entity called Astana International Financial Center, which has been advised by the high court members of working in London. And basically, it's an entity or legal structure that works under the British law. So I guess if you will be looking into some ingenious financial engineering, it could be coming from there. That's my guess.
Thank you.
I would just add to that it's the ingenious financial engineering or the legal contracts or whatever come downstream from the political leadership. If there is a desire to remove kleptocracy from the political economy of Kazakhstan, then the legal advisors and the financiers will act accordingly. If there's not, they will also take that signal and act accordingly. So, you know, lawyers draft contracts based on the desires of their clients. And, you know, we have seen some discouraging signs. We can only hope that the president doesn't choose that course at this stage.
Thank you. Bhavna.
Thank you. Questions to Aydar as well as Kassym Khan. Aydar, you talked about the dialectical contradictions in Tokayev. I like the phrase. And also pointed at lots of examples of Obasanjo and others who have the role they have played. But you know the difference, that Tokayev is not a politician, not an opposition, unlike Corazon Aquino or Obasanjo and many others. He has been a chinovnik, diplomat, and he was appointed, chosen by Nazarbayev, by the regime, and his kind of grooming as successor was long in the making. So, and he was promoted, Nazarbayev handed over power to him because of certain assurance that Tokayev is not going to start this whole process. Now, under duress, he has started the process of de-Nazarbayevification. That wasn't really the original idea. It's that the events moved ahead and they have forced him to play this role. So just your responses and just specific question on the Astana Financial Center. I don't know, but I think my impression is also that China under BRI is also very actively looking at it for investing. So if you can say something about that. Second is the PSA that you talked about and looking at all those oil contracts, that also applies to China very much. So even if looking at those contract details with the US and Western countries is a problem, what about the deals with China? Finally, I just remember this name, Bolat Utemuratov, who used to be very close to Nazarbayev. And from what I heard in Kazakhstan, that he is now part of some kind of charity, humanitarian, some organization. So there are many people like this, the oligarchs or connected to oligarchs and who manage Nazarbayev's assets. And now they have kind of transformed themselves into some sort of benevolent kind of figures. So, and if there is time, something about Siroyeshkin case and Konstantin Siroyeshkin, who is still in jail. Tokayev has no intention of looking at this, and his role with China, Kazakhstan. Thank you.
Who wants to start? I know, you go.
Maybe I'll answer part of it, part of the questions that I'm able to. The phrase comes from Hegel, who read the philosophy of law. Hegel discusses the unity of contradictions. And I mentioned it because actually Hegel was mentioned by Tokayev in his speech for businessmen back on 21st of January. You know, with regards to Bulat Utemuratov, you know, everybody wants to go, as I said, the way of Michael Corleone. They want to forget the past. to clean it and to have a bright future, better future, and they want to be, you know, more saint than the Pope. With regards to Sereshkin, I don't know the details of the case. It's non-transparent. Apart that he is one of the two accused for trying to take over the state power. I forgot the second question. Baba, could you remind me?
The Astana Financial Center, and then looking at the PSA oil contracts with China, how
Right.
that be done?
Right. Well, the American and Chinese mutual investment agreements are very much similar. I mean, the irony is even in the name. Mutual investment agreements. They are dated early 90s. Now, guess how much investments were made by the USA into Kazakhstan, and how much of the investments were made by Kazakhstan into the USA. So that will give you an idea how mutual it is. Chinese mutual investment agreement is concentrated very much, basically solely, on transporting oil from Kazakhstan to China. So this is just as mutual. We don't have, I don't know if we have representatives of China, but I understand we have more representatives of the West. So I was trying to call to, you know, to entertain the idea that actually there is, I wouldn't call that you are guilty, you know, this all happened because of you, but I would say that there is a strong contribution and a critical contribution by the mineral resources contracts. With regards to the behavior of Tokayev, I have a guess that during his years in China, he saw that Chinese People's Republic used convergence. So for areas of education and medicine, they used the laws of mechanisms of socialism, and for the market, they used the laws of capitalism. And that gave effect that I think resulted into 9% per year growth of GDP for more than 20 years. However, my personal observation that no communistic regime survived so far, except for China. And with regards to China, we also see signs of slowing down. For me, the very indicative signs, you know, that few years ago, my favorite Chinese movie director, Zhang Yimou, had to pay a fine of $15 million for having more than one child. And, you know, he had to publicly excuse, although he is a very influential figure of art in China. I think he is director of Beijing Olympic Games. Also, we see what happened to the University of Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba. I think they try to limit it, and I understand successfully. So it seems that totalitarian elements are showing off more now than you know, than the initiative to be progressive and liberal. That's my part of the answer. Anything else maybe Kassym Khan can add?
Yes, well, China and AIFC. So right now there are several shareholders in Astana International Exchange, which is the main body of the AIFC, and one of them is Silk Road Fund, and the other one is Shanghai Stock Exchange, accompanied by Goldman Sachs and Nasdaq. So basically, you can say that Chinese already are invested in the project. If we're talking about Chinese deals in Kazakhstan, well, one of the deals I think that got the most attention was the debt financing of the lightweight railway transit in Astana, which became we call it the monument of corruption, still raised in the middle of the capital. But on the other hand, we see that the government will try to finish this construction and basically forget about this incident. And as Aidar previously said, that the personal experience of current president and his understanding of Eastern philosophy that he likes to highlight in international events, and the recent visit by the head of China to Kazakhstan, which was his first foreign trip, and the recent assembly of Chinese Communist Party that we all witnessed. So all these things can basically provide us with some understanding of what the ties will be between Kazakhstan's current leadership and China. And I think that it is wise to consider that with Russia effectively being out of the picture, so the influence of our eastern neighbor would only increase in the region. And it's not only about the funding, the money, it's also about more of a political influence.
Thank you very much.
One of the, if I could just add quickly on Chinese element in the oil industry, we have a fund, asset recovery fund, private, called Yelge Kaytaru. It's a civil fund, public fund. By the way, Bavna, Bulat Abilov is one of the founders of that fund. So, and this is one of his primary roles right now. One of the deals with regards to CNPC, and this is a M&A deal on acquisition of 69%, I think, or 67% in Aktübe Munay Gas, has been discussed by this fund. And apparently it wasn't a clear-cut deal, and there are some disproportionate figures as to how this deal was done and how listing was used to avoid taxes. So actually, the society is moving towards one of the major Chinese deals.
Interesting, thank you. Hugh?
I'd like to ask a question about social issues in Kazakhstan. That's come up a little bit in the conversations. I'm genuinely puzzled about how one or two issues. We've heard that Kazakhstan government has been pumping money into the to social benefits to stabilize the social situation, particularly since January, but before that as well. On the other hand, we heard Kasim Khan say at the beginning of your talk that 1 million children are living in poverty in rural areas. Human Rights Watch just published a study on one of the main pillars of the social welfare system in Kazakhstan, the targeted social assistance program, which helps the poorest, and how broken it is, and how ineffective it is, and how low the benefit levels are. So it seems to me that there is not an effective social welfare system in Kazakhstan, despite the fact that there's much money apparently being pumped into this system. Kasim Khan, can you help me understand that? Or somebody else?
Yes, let me start, and maybe colleagues will add. So there is a social welfare program in place, but it's not a big part. It's a growing part of the budget expenditures, but it's still not as big in Russia, for example. So the pension fund is has been separated from the state budget. So we're talking only about the social assistance coming from the state budget. The size of this social assistance is relatively small. It's still linked to this minimal survival level, which is being criticized because right now the size is, let me say, I think. So Minimal salary in Kazakhstan right now is less than $5 per day. And the World Bank has, for the middle income countries, the level of poverty of $5 per day. So basically we're talking about that even employed people are below the poverty rate. If we're talking about rural families, usually it's families with 3 or more kids. 5 kids is quite normal in the South Kazakhstan. So this issue is gonna prevail. It's gonna be on the table for the next decade. Some investments were made in South Kazakhstan, in Turkestan, for example. The whole new city was built. I just visited it last weekend, and it's impressive, but it's still underinvested region. The jobs are the issue, especially jobs for young people. So there will be a big push. I see that there will be a big push from the state budget to fund these kind of various state programs to provide some kind of employment in the region. But also, as I said, money for loyalty is a deal that was efficient during Nazarbayev, and I think nobody can refuse it even after this election. Thank you.
Should we move on? John?
My question is maybe a good one to summarize almost, because I've been listening to both panels and it doesn't seem like there's a great deal of, there's a little of hope. You mentioned hope twice, but I don't see any substance in the hope. I mean, clearly there's some good things that have happened. There's some after the January events, there's some attempts to de-oligarchization, but what's going to drive change in Kazakhstan? And is there anything that you can see on the horizon that will really drive change? Because it sounds really more like it's a sense of status quo, quiet status quo, maybe some changes around the edges, but what do you see? And I'll aim it at you, Ben, because you're here in the room, but what do you see as a potential driver in the future that we haven't talked about? So, I mean, looking for the positive, I'd say probably, I sort of say to myself, Kazakhstan is probably better today than it was yesterday before the January events, right? There has been a transfer of power. There is a new generation coming through. And people, a lot of people have stayed, frankly, but there is a sense that there are some new people coming through. I think what Aydar said about the president having tremendous international experience and being a sort of consummate professional, I've certainly noticed, speaking to civil servants, there's been a bit more of a sense of professionalization around the civil service. And certainly when you interact with, I first started going to sort of to meet members of the government and the state-owned enterprises sort of in the 2008, 2009 period. The level of education and professionalization that you see among people today, if you meet anyone that's head of department higher in the civil service, and certainly vice minister, ministerial level, deputy CEO, CEO level, the quality of the people is extremely high. And certainly the people that I interact with were extremely pleased to see this change happen in January because, the government has a lot of flaws. Certainly a real challenge is sort of joined up thinking and acting within the government, for example. But it doesn't mean that the people in the government are somehow stupid or unaware of what the problems are. Many of them really are, and they did see January as an opportunity to move things forward because, they don't need to commission another $100,000 McKinsey report to tell them what needs to be done. They know what needs to be done. And certainly there is a lot of, within the civil service, there is a lot of drive to see that done. But as Kassym Khan says, there are these constraints. We have the war, we have the social tensions, and that is causing the government to really duck for cover and resort to, again, social welfare, a statist approach, because, you start introducing freedoms into the political system or to the economy, you never quite know where that's going to end. The other negative, really, I think, is corruption. We are starting to see that some of these relations are coming back. Hopefully, we can only hope that they remain very much at the sidelines. I'm not sure I've given much hope for that, but
Just to add to that, I think Kazakhstan's been so good with the trappings of using PR to present this image of what it wants to present and not what it really is, that people get lured into this trap, that it's a much more progressive nation than it is, and not such a kind of personalistic economy. You know, it's an autocratic governance system. You know, that's what it is. And even they can talk about democracy, but that's not going to change soon. There's one more question that I think is a good one to end on, which is from Joanna Lillis. And it's really questioning how sincere President Tokayev's desire is for this de-oligopolization, and whether he's actually the right person to do the job, which is, you know, quite timely ahead of the elections. Not that we're trying to interfere in any shape or form, and she references some report, the recent report in the Public Eye publication about the business interests of the president and his family. Is he the right man to do the job? Turning to Almaty for this question.
Okay, well, he definitely states that he is, and his target is to make an impression that he is. As I said today in the news, we've heard that he ordered due diligence of one of the major foreign investors, Lakshmi Mittal, and his plant because of the deaths. You know, Mittal here is perceived maybe as an excellent foreign investor, although I understand in the world he has a notorious reputation. At least if you read again the same Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st century. He is trying to be decisive. He gathers these oligarchs and he threatens them basically that he is going to do a fair division and distribution of wealth. There is hope in these very words. Now, how consistent will be, the future will show. But he has, as I said, he has a higher education, he's a professional. The rumor says it that he's not really rich. So during the 30 years of being with Nazarbayev, he didn't become a billionaire or maybe even a millionaire, and that doesn't make him an oligarch. So in himself, he is not an oligarch, and I think that's a token of hope that he will be able to achieve, you know, at least 30–40% of success in that. Samkhan, maybe you want to add?
Yeah, I'm just trying to draw some parallels from recent history, and we all know that the first president of Russia was surrounded by oligarchs that were seen as a very bad factors for Russia's development, and there were a lot of hopes for second president to be distant from oligarchs, and at the end of the day we probably received even worse case of crony capitalism. So that's my main concern of what's to be to watch out for, and I hope, yes, I have a lot of hope that the educational background and the international experience would save the second president from doing the same mistakes in case of Kazakhstan. But at the same time, we all know that the history repeats itself in a very interesting ways. To be hopeful, one of the recent news probably you've heard of is concerning the hydrogen deal that Kazakhstan has reached with the European Union and was signed yesterday. So probably the emergence of new sectors of the economy would also help to diversify the group and maybe provide more inclusion for the society and emergence of new businesses that would be more transparent and more connected with the global economy. So that's my hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. So brilliant to have you beaming in from Almaty, the joys of Zoom when it's like this. So thank you both, and thank you to Ben for a brilliant session. Made us all very hungry.